Chapter 1, Part 1 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Russell Newton. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 1, Part 1. The Man in the Iron Mask, an Essay. For nearly 100 years, this curious problem has exercised the imagination of writers of fiction, and of drama, and the patience of the learned in history. No subject is more obscure and elusive, and none more attractive to the general mind. It is a legend to the meaning of which none can find the key, and yet in which everyone believes. Involuntarily, we feel pity at the thought of that long captivity, surrounded by so many extraordinary precautions, and when we dwell on the mystery which enveloped the captive, that pity is not only deepened, but a kind of terror takes possession of us. It is very likely that if the name of the hero of this gloomy tale had been known at the time, he would now be forgotten. To give him a name would be to relegate him at once to the ranks of those commonplace offenders, who quickly exhaust our interest and our tears. But this being, cut off from the world without leaving any discoverable trace, and whose disappearance apparently caused no void, this captive, distinguished among captives by the unexampled nature of his punishment, a prison within a prison, as if the walls of a mere cell were not narrow enough, has come to typify for us the sum of all the human misery and suffering ever inflicted by unjust tyranny. Who was the man in the iron mask? Was he wrapped away into this silent seclusion from the luxury of a court, from the intrigues of diplomacy, from the scaffold of a traitor, from the clash of battle? What did he leave behind? Love, glory, or a throne? What did he regret when hope had fled? Did he pour forth imprecations and curses on his tortures and blaspheme against high heaven? Or did he with a sigh possess his soul in patience? The blows of fortune are differently received according to the different characters of those on whom they fall, and each one of us who in imagination threads the subterranean passages leading to the cells of Pignerol and exiles, and incarcerates himself in the Ile Sainte-Marguerite and in the Bastille, the successive scenes of that long protracted agony will give the prisoner a form shaped by his own fancy, and a grief proportioned to his own power of suffering. How we long to pierce the thoughts, and feel the heartbeats, and watch the trickling tears behind that machine-like exterior, that impassible mask. Our imagination is powerfully excited by the dumbness of that fate borne by one whose words never reached the outward air, whose thoughts could never be read on the hidden features, by the isolation of 40 years, secured by twofold barriers of stone and iron. And she clothes the object of her contemplation in majestic splendor, connects the mystery which enveloped his existence with mighty interests, and persists in regarding the prisoner as sacrificed for the preservation of some dynastic secret involving the peace of the world and the stability of a throne. And when we calmly reflect on the whole case, do we feel that our first impulsively adopted opinion was wrong? Do we regard our belief as a poetical illusion? I do not think so. On the contrary, it seems to me that our good sense approves our fancy's flight. For what can be more natural than the conviction that the secret of the name, age, and features of the captive, which was so perseveringly kept through long years at the cost of so much care, was of vital importance to the government? No ordinary human passion, such as anger, hate, or vengeance, has so dogged and enduring a character. We feel that the measures taken were not the expression of a love of cruelty, for even supposing that Louis XIV were the most cruel of princes, would he not have chosen one of the 1,000 methods of torture ready to his hand, before inventing a new and strange one? Moreover, why did he voluntarily burden himself with the obligation of surrounding a prisoner with such numberless precautions and such sleepless vigilance? Must he not have feared that in spite of it all, the walls behind which he concealed the dread mystery would one day let in the light? Was it not through his entire reign a source of unceasing anxiety? And yet he respected the life of the captive whom it was so difficult to hide, and the discovery of whose identity would have been so dangerous. It would have been so easy to bury the secret in an obscure grave, and yet the order was never given. Was this an expression of hate, anger, or any other passion? Certainly not. The conclusion we must come to in regard to the conduct of the king is that all the measures he took against the prisoner were dictated by purely political motives, that his conscience, while allowing him to do everything necessary to guard the secret, did not permit him to take the further step of putting an end to the days of an unfortunate man, who in all probability was guilty of no crime. Courtiers are seldom obsequious to the enemies of their master, so that we may regard the respect and consideration shown to the man in the mask by the governor Saint Mars and the minister Louvois as a testimony not only to his high rank, but also to his innocence. For my part, I make no pretensions to the erudition of the bookworm, and I cannot read the history of the man in the iron mask without feeling my blood boil at the abominable abuse of power, the heinous crime of which he was the victim. A few years ago, Monsieur Fournier and I, thinking the subject suitable for a representation on the stage, undertook to read, before dramatizing it, all the different versions of the affair which had been published up to that time. Since our piece was successfully performed at the Odeon, 2 other versions have appeared. One was in the form of a letter addressed to the Historical Institute by Monsieur Billiard, who upheld the conclusions arrived at by Soulavie, on whose narrative our play was founded. The other was a work by the bibliophile Jacob, who followed a new system of inquiry and whose book displayed the results of deep research and extensive reading. It did not, however, cause me to change my opinion. Even had it been published before I had written my drama, I should still have adhered to the idea as to the most probable solution of the problem which I had arrived at in 1831. Not only because it was incontestably the most dramatic, but also because it is supported by those moral presumptions which have such weight with us when considering a dark and doubtful question like the one before us. It will be objected, perhaps, that dramatic writers, in their love of the marvelous and the pathetic, neglect logic and strain after effect, their aim being to obtain the applause of the gallery rather than the approbation of the learned. But to this it may be replied that the learned on their part sacrifice a great deal to their love of dates, more or less exact, to their desire to elucidate some point which had hitherto been considered obscure, and which their explanations do not always clear up, to the temptation to display their proficiency in the ingenious art of manipulating facts and figures culled from a dozen musty volumes into one consistent whole. Our interest in this strange case of imprisonment arises, not alone from its completeness and duration, but also from our uncertainty as to the motives from which it was inflicted, where erudition alone cannot suffice, where bookworm after bookworm, disdaining the conjectures of his predecessors, comes forward with a new theory, founded on some forgotten document he has hunted out, only to find himself in his turn pushed into oblivion by some follower in his track. We must turn for guidance to some other light than that of scholarship, especially if, on strict investigation, we find that not one learned solution rests on a sound basis of fact. In the question before us, which, as we said before, is a double one, asking not only who was the man in the iron mask, but why he was relentlessly subjected to this torture till the moment of his death, what we need in order to restrain our fancy is mathematical demonstration, and not philosophical induction. While I do not go so far as to assert positively that Abbé Soulavie has once and for all lifted the veil which hid the truth, I am yet persuaded that no other system of research is superior to his, and that no other suggested solution has so many presumptions in its favor. I have not reached this firm conviction on account of the great and prolonged success of our drama, but because of the ease with which all the opinions adverse to those of the abbé may be annihilated by pitting them one against the other. The qualities that make for success being quite different in a novel and in a drama, I could easily have founded a romance on the fictitious loves of Buckingham and the Queen, or on a supposed secret marriage between her and Cardinal Mazarin, calling to my aid a work by Saint Mihiel, which the bibliophile declares he has never read, although it is assuredly neither rare nor difficult of access. I might also have merely expanded my drama, restoring to the personages therein their true names and relative positions, both of which the exigencies of the stage had sometimes obliged me to alter, and while allowing them to fill the same parts, making them act more in accordance with historical fact. No fable, however far-fetched, no grouping of characters, however improbable, can, however, destroy the interest which the innumerable writings about the Iron Mask excite, although no two agree in details, and although each author and each witness declares himself in possession of complete knowledge. No work, however mediocre, however worthless even, which has appeared on this subject has ever failed of success, not even, for example, the strange jumble of Chevalier de Mohy, a kind of literary braggart, who was in the pay of Voltaire and whose work was published anonymously in 1746 by Pierre Dahont of The Hague. It is divided into 6 short parts and bears the title Le Masque de Fer, ou les Aventures Admirables du Père et du Fils, an absurd romance by Renaud Warin, and one at least equally absurd by Madame Guenard, met with a like favorable reception. In writing for the theatre, an author must choose one view of a dramatic situation to the exclusion of all others, and in following out this central idea is obliged by the inexorable laws of logic to push aside everything that interferes with its development. A book, on the contrary, is written to be discussed. It brings under the notice of the reader all the evidence produced at a trial which has as yet not reached a definite conclusion, and which in the case before us will never reach it, unless, which is most improbable, some lucky chance should lead to some new discovery. The first mention of the prisoner is to be found in the Mémoires écrites pour servir à l'histoire de Perse, in one volume, by an anonymous author, published by the Compagnie des Libraires Associés d'Amsterdam in 1745, not having any other purpose, says the author, page 20, second edition, than to relate facts which are not known, or about which no one has written. We refer at once to a fact which has hitherto almost escaped notice concerning Prince Guerre, Louis de Bourbon, Comte de Vermandois, son of Louis XIV, and Mademoiselle de la Vallière, who was visited by Ali Mamajou, the Duke d'Orléans, the regent, in the fortress of Ispahan, the Bastille, in which he had been imprisoned for several years. The visit had probably no other motive than to make sure that this prince was really alive, he having been reputed dead of the plague for over 30 years, and his obsequies having been celebrated in presence of an entire army. Shah Abbas, Louis XIV, had a legitimate son, Sefi Mirza, Louis, Dauphin of France, and a natural son, Guerre. These two princes, as dissimilar in character as in birth, were always rivals, and always at enmity with each other. One day, Guerre so far forgot himself as to strike Sefi Mirza. Shah Abbas, having heard of the insult offered to the heir to the throne, assembled his most trusted counselors and laid the conduct of the culprit before them, conduct which, according to the law of the country, was punishable with death, an opinion in which they all agreed. One of the counselors, however, sympathizing more than the others with the distress of Shah Abbas, suggested that Guerre should be sent to the army, which was then on the frontiers of Fidrun, Flanders, and that his death from plague should be given out a few days after his arrival. Then, while the whole army was celebrating his obsequies, he should be carried off by night, in the greatest secrecy, to the stronghold on the Isle of Ormus, Saint Marguerite, and there imprisoned for life. This course was adopted and carried out by faithful and discreet agents. The prince, whose premature death was mourned by the army, being carried by unfrequented roads to the Isle of Ormus, was placed in the custody of the commandant of the island, who had received orders beforehand not to allow any person whatever to see the prisoner. A single servant who was in possession of the secret was killed by the escort on the journey, and his face so disfigured by dagger thrusts that he could not be recognized. The commandant treated his prisoner with the most profound respect. He waited on him at meals himself, taking the dishes from the cooks at the door of the apartment, none of whom ever looked on the face of Guerre. One day it occurred to the prince to scratch his name on the back of a plate with his knife. One of the servants into whose hands the plate fell ran with it at once to the commandant, hoping he would be pleased and reward the bearer. But the unfortunate man was greatly mistaken, for he was at once made away with, that his knowledge of such an important secret might be buried with himself. Guerre remained several years in the castle Ormus, and was then transported to the fortress of Ispahan, the commandant of Ormus having received the governorship of Ispahan as a reward for his faithful service. At Ispahan, as at Ormus, whenever it was necessary on account of illness or any other cause to allow anyone to approach the prince, he was always masked, and several trustworthy persons have asserted that they had seen the masked prisoner often, and had noticed that he used the familiar tu when addressing the governor, while the latter showed his charge the greatest respect. As Guerre survived Shah Abbas and Sefi Mirza by many years, it may be asked why he was never set at liberty, but it must be remembered it would have been impossible to restore a prince to his rank and dignities whose tomb actually existed, and of whose burial there were not only living witnesses, but documentary proofs, the authenticity of which it would have been useless to deny, so firm was the belief, which had lasted down to the present day, that Guerre died of the plague in camp when with the army on the frontiers of Flanders. Ali Homajou died shortly after the visit he paid to Guerre. This version of the story, which is the original source of all the controversy on the subject, was at first generally received as true. On a critical examination, it fitted in very well with certain events which took place in the reign of Louis XIV. The Comte de Vermandois had in fact left the court for the camp very soon after his reappearance there, for he had been banished by the king from his presence some time before for having, in company with several young nobles, indulged in the most reprehensible excesses. The king, says Mademoiselle de Montpensier, Memoirs de Mademoiselle de Montpensier, volume 14, page 474, of Memoirs relatives d'Histoire de France, second series, published by Petitot, had not been satisfied with his conduct and refused to see him. The young prince had caused his mother much sorrow, but had been so well lectured that it was believed that he had at last turned over a new leaf. He only remained 4 days at court, reached the camp before Courtrai early in November 1683, was taken ill on the evening of the 12th, and died on the 19th of the same month of a malignant fever. Mademoiselle de Montpensier says that the Comte de Vermandois fell ill from drink. There are, of course, objections of all kinds to this theory. For if, during the 4 days the Comte was at court, he had struck the Dauphin, everyone would have heard of the monstrous crime, and yet it is nowhere spoken of, except in the Memoirs de Pierce. What renders the story of the blow still more improbable is the difference in age between the two princes. The Dauphin, who already had a son, the Duc de Bourgogne, more than a year old, was born the 1st November 1661, and was therefore 6 years older than the Comte de Vermandois. But the most complete answer to the tale is to be found in a letter written by Barbezieux to Saint-Mars, dated the 13th August, 1691. When you have any information to send me relative to the prisoner who has been in your charge for 20 years, I most earnestly enjoin on you to take the same precautions as when you write to Monsieur de Louvois. The Comte de Vermandois, the official registration of whose death bears the date 1685, cannot have been 20 years as a prisoner in 1691. 6 years after the man in the mask had been thus delivered over to the curiosity of the public, the Cycle de Louis XIV, 2 volumes, octavo, Berlin, 1751, was published by Voltaire under the pseudonym of Monsieur de Franceville. Everyone turned to this work, which had been long expected, for details relating to the mysterious prisoner about whom everyone was talking. Voltaire ventured at length to speak more openly of the prisoner than anyone had hitherto done, and to treat as a matter of history an event long ignored by all historians. Volume 2, page 11, first edition, chapter 15. He assigned an approximate date to the beginning of this captivity, some months after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, 1661. He gave a description of the prisoner, who according to him was young and dark-complexioned. His figure was above the middle height and well proportioned. His features were exceedingly handsome, and his bearing was noble. When he spoke, his voice inspired interest. He never complained of his lot, and gave no hint as to his rank, nor was the mask forgotten. The part which covered the chin was furnished with steel springs, which allowed the prisoner to eat without uncovering his face. And lastly, he fixed the date of the death of the nameless captive, who was buried, he says, in 1704 by night in the parish church of St. Paul. Voltaire's narrative coincided with the account given in the Memoirs de Pierce, save for the omission of the incident which, according to the Memoirs, led in the first instance to the imprisonment of Guerre. The prisoner, says Voltaire, was sent to the Ile Saint-Marguerite and afterwards to the Bastille in charge of a trusty official. He wore his mask on the journey, and his escort had orders to shoot him if he took it off. The Marquis de Louvois visited him while he was on the islands, and when speaking to him stood all the time in a respectful attitude. The prisoner was removed to the Bastille in 1690, where he was lodged as comfortably as could be managed in that building. He was supplied with everything he asked for, especially with the finest linen and the costliest lace, in both of which his taste was perfect. He had a guitar to play on, his table was excellent, and the governor rarely sat in his presence. End of Chapter 1, Part 1.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
Chapter 1, Part 2 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2. by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Josh Kibbe. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 1, Part 2. Voltaire added a few further details which had been given him by Monsieur de Bernaville, the successor to Monsieur de Saint-Mars, and by an old physician of the Bastille who had attended the prisoner whenever his health required a doctor, but who had never seen his face, although he had often seen his tongue and his body. He also asserted that Monsieur de Chamillard was the last minister who was in the secret, and that when his son-in-law, Marshal de la Feuillade, besought him on his knees, de Chamillard being on his deathbed, to tell him the name of the man in the iron mask, the minister replied that he was under a solemn oath never to reveal the secret, it being an affair of state. To all these details, which the marshal acknowledges to be correct, Voltaire adds a remarkable note. What increases our wonder is, that when the unknown captive was sent to the Ile Sainte Marguerite, no personage of note disappeared from the European stage. The story of the Comte de Vermandois and the blow was treated as an absurd and romantic invention, which does not even attempt to keep within the bounds of the possible, by Baron C., according to P. Marchand, Baron Crungen, in a letter inserted in the Bibliothèque raisonnée des ouvrages des savants d'Europe, June 1745. The discussion was revived somewhat later, however, and a few Dutch scholars were supposed to be responsible for a new theory founded on history. The foundations proving somewhat shaky, however, a quality which it shares, we must say, with all the other theories which have ever been advanced. According to this new theory, the masked prisoner was a young foreign nobleman, groom of the chambers to Anne of Austria, and the real father of Louis XIV. This anecdote appears first in a 12mo volume printed by Pierre Marteau at Cologne in 1692, and which bears the title, The Loves of Anne of Austria, Consort of Louis XIII, with Monsieur le Cdr, the real father of Louis XIV, King of France, being a minute account of the measures taken to give an heir to the throne of France, the influences at work to bring this to pass, and the denouement of the comedy. This libel ran through 5 editions, bearing dates successively 1692, 1693, 1696, 1722, and 1738. In the title of the edition of 1696, the words Cardinal de Richelieu are inserted in place of the initials CDR, but that this is only a printer's error everyone who reads the work will perceive. Some have thought that the 3 letters stood for Comte de Rivière, others for Comte de Rochefort, whose Memoirs, compiled by Sandras de Courtils, supply these initials. The author of the book was an orange rider in the pay of William III, and its object was, he says, to unveil the great mystery of iniquity which hid the true origin of Louis XIV. He goes on to remark that the knowledge of this fraud, although comparatively rare outside France, was widely spread within her borders. The well-known coldness of Louis XIII, the extraordinary birth of Louis Dieudonne, so called because he was born in the 23rd year of a childless marriage, and several other remarkable circumstances connected with the birth, all point clearly to a father other than the prince, who with great effrontery is passed off by his adherents as such. The famous barricades of Paris and the organized revolt led by distinguished men against Louis XIV on his accession to the throne proclaimed aloud the king's illegitimacy, so that it rang through the country, and as the accusation had reason on its side, hardly anyone doubted its truth. We give below a short abstract of the narrative, the plot of which is rather skillfully constructed. Cardinal Richelieu, looking with satisfied pride at the love of Gaston, Duc d'Orléans, brother of the king, for his niece Parisiatis, Madame de Combelay, formed the plan of uniting the young couple in marriage. Gaston, taking the suggestion as an insult, struck the cardinal. Père Joseph then tried to gain the cardinal's consent and that of his niece to an attempt to deprive Gaston of the throne, which the childless marriage of Louis XIII seemed to assure him. A young man, the CDR of the book, was introduced into Anne of Austria's room, who though a wife in name, had long been a widow in reality. She defended herself, but feebly, and on seeing the cardinal next day said to him, "Well, you have had your wicked will, but take good care, Sir Cardinal, that I may find above the mercy and goodness which you have tried by many pious sophistries to convince me is awaiting me. Watch over my soul, I charge you, for I have yielded." The queen, having given herself up to love for some time, the joyful news that she would soon become a mother began to spread over the kingdom. In this manner was born Louis XIV, the putative son of Louis XIII. If this installment of the tale be favorably received, says the pamphleteer, the sequel will soon follow, in which the sad fate of CDR will be related, who was made to pay dearly for a short-lived pleasure. Although the first part was a great success, the promised sequel never appeared. It must be admitted that such a story, though it never convinced a single person of the illegitimacy of Louis XIV, was an excellent prologue to the tale of the unfortunate lot of the Man in the Iron Mask, and increased the interest and curiosity with which that singular historical mystery was regarded. But the views of the Dutch scholars thus set forth met with little credence, and were soon forgotten in a new solution. The third historian to write about the prisoner of the Ile Sainte-Marguerite was Le Grand Chancel. He was just 29 years of age when, excited by Fréron's hatred of Voltaire, he addressed a letter from his country place, Antoniat, in Périgord, to the Année Littéraire, Volume 3, page 188, demolishing the theory advanced in the Siècle de Louis XIV, and giving facts which he had collected whilst himself imprisoned in the same place as the unknown prisoner 20 years later. My detention in the Ile Sainte-Marguerite, says Le Grand Chancel, brought many things to my knowledge which a more painstaking historian than Monsieur de Voltaire would have taken the trouble to find out. For at the time when I was taken to the islands, the imprisonment of the Man in the Iron Mask was no longer regarded as a state secret. This extraordinary event, which Monsieur de Voltaire places in 1662, a few months after the death of Cardinal Mazarin, did not take place till 1669, 8 years after the death of His Eminence. Monsieur de la Motte-Guerin, commandant of the islands in my time, assured me that the prisoner was the Duc de Beaufort, who was reported killed at the siege of Candia, but whose body had never been recovered, as all the narratives of that event agree in stating. He also told me that Monsieur de Saint-Mars, who succeeded Pignerol as governor of the islands, showed great consideration for the prisoner, that he waited on him at table, that the service was of silver, and that the clothes supplied to the prisoner were as costly as he desired. That when he was ill and in need of a physician or surgeon, he was obliged under pain of death to wear his mask in their presence, but that when he was alone, he was permitted to pull out the hairs of his beard with steel tweezers, which were kept bright and polished. I saw a pair of these, which had been actually used for this purpose in the possession of Monsieur de Formanois, nephew of Saint-Mars, and lieutenant of a free company raised for the purpose of guarding the prisoners. Several persons told me that when Saint-Mars, who had been placed over the Bastille, conducted his charge thither, the latter was heard to say behind his iron mask, "Has the king designs on my life?" To which Saint-Mars replied, "No, my prince. Your life is safe. You must only let yourself be guided." I also learned from a man called Dubuisson, cashier to the well-known Samuel Bernard, who, having been imprisoned for some years in the Bastille, was removed to the Ile Sainte-Marguerite, where he was confined along with some others in a room exactly over the one occupied by the unknown prisoner. He told me that they were able to communicate with him by means of the flue of the chimney, but on asking him why he persisted in not revealing his name and the cause of his imprisonment, he replied that such an avowal would be fatal not only to him, but to those to whom he made it. Whether it were so or not, today the name and rank of this political victim are secrets the preservation of which is no longer necessary to the state, and I have thought that to tell the public what I know would cut short the long chain of circumstances which everyone was forging according to his fancy, instigated thereto by an author whose gift of relating the most impossible events in such a manner as to make them seem true has won for all his writings such success, even for his Vie de Charles XII. This theory, according to Jacob, is more probable than any of the others. Beginning with the year 1664, he says, the Duc de Beaufort had by his insubordination and levity endangered the success of several maritime expeditions. In October 1666, Louis XIV remonstrated with him with much tact, begging him to try to make himself more and more capable in the service of his king by cultivating the talents with which he was endowed, and ridding himself of the faults which spoilt his conduct. I do not doubt, he concludes, that you will be all the more grateful to me for this mark of my benevolence towards you, when you reflect how few kings have ever shown their goodwill in a similar manner. Oeuvres de Louis XIV, Volume 5, page 388. Several calamities in the Royal Navy are known to have been brought about by the Duc de Beaufort. Monsieur Eugène Sue, in his Histoire de la Marine, which is full of new and curious information, has drawn a very good picture of the position of the Roi des Halles, the King of the Markets, in regard to Colbert and Louis XIV. Colbert wished to direct all the maneuvers of the fleet from his study, while it was commanded by the naval Grand-Master in the capricious manner which might be expected from his factious character and love of bluster. Eugène Sue, Volume 1, Pièces justificatives. In 1699, Louis XIV sent the Duc de Beaufort to the relief of Candia, which the Turks were besieging. 7 hours after his arrival, Beaufort was killed in a sortie. The Duc de Navailles, who shared with him the command of the French squadron, simply reported his death as follows. He met a body of Turks who were pressing our troops hard. Placing himself at the head of the latter, he fought valiantly, but at length his soldiers abandoned him, and we have not been able to learn his fate. Memoires du Duc de Navailles, Book 4, page 243. The report of his death spread rapidly through France and Italy. Magnificent funeral services were held in Paris, Rome, and Venice, and funeral orations delivered. Nevertheless, many believed that he would one day reappear, as his body had never been recovered. Guy Patin mentions this belief, which he did not share, in 2 of his letters. Several wagers have been laid that Monsieur de Beaufort is not dead. O utinam. Guy Patin, September 26, 1669. It is said that Monsieur de Vauvan has been granted by commission the post of Vice-Admiral of France for 20 years. But there are many who believe that the Duc de Beaufort is not dead, but imprisoned in some Turkish island. Believe this who may, I don't. He is really dead, and the last thing I should desire would be to be as dead as he. Ibid, January 14, 1670. The following are the objections to this theory. In several narratives written by eyewitnesses of the siege of Candia, says Jacob, it is related that the Turks, according to their custom, despoiled the body and cut off the head of the Duc de Beaufort on the field of battle, and that the latter was afterwards exhibited at Constantinople, and this may account for some of the details given by Sanders de Courtilz in his Memoires du Marquis de Montbrun and his Memoires d'Artagnan, for one can easily imagine that the naked, headless body might escape recognition. Monsieur Eugène Sue, in his Histoire de la Marine, Volume 2, Chapter 6, had adopted this view, which coincides with the account left by Philibert de Géry and the Marquis de Ville, the messengers of whose letters and memoirs to be found in the Bibliothèque du Roi. In the first volume of the Histoire de la Détention des Philosophes et des gens de lettres à la Bastille, etc., we find the following passage. Without dwelling on the difficulty and danger of an abduction, which an Ottoman scimitar might any day during this memorable siege render unnecessary, we shall restrict ourselves to declaring positively that the correspondence of Saint-Mars from 1669 to 1680 gives us no ground for supposing that the governor of Pignerol had any great prisoner of state in his charge during that period of time, except Fouquet and Lauzun. While we profess no blind faith in the conclusions arrived at by the learned critic, we would yet add to the considerations on which he relies another, viz., that it is most improbable that Louis XIV should ever have considered it necessary to take such rigorous measures against the Duc de Beaufort. Truculent and self-confident as he was, he never acted against the royal authority in such a manner as to oblige the king to strike him down in secret. And it is difficult to believe that Louis XIV, peaceably seated on his throne, with all the enemies of his minority under his feet, should have revenged himself on the Duke as an old Frondeur. The critic calls our attention to another fact also adverse to the theory under consideration. The man in the Iron Mask loved fine linen and rich lace. He was reserved in character and possessed of extreme refinement, and none of this suits the portraits of the roi des Halles which contemporary historians have drawn. Regarding the anagram of the name Marchiali, the name under which the death of the prisoner was registered, hic Amaral, as a proof, we cannot think that the jailers of Pignerol amused themselves in propounding conundrums to exercise the keen intellect of their contemporaries, and moreover the same anagram would apply equally well to the Count of Vermandois, who was made admiral when only 22 months old. Abbé Pepin, in his Roamings through Provence, paid a visit to the prison in which the Iron Mask was confined, and thus speaks. It was to the Ile Sainte Marguerite that the famous prisoner with the Iron Mask, whose name has never been discovered, was transported at the end of the last century. Very few of those attached to his service were allowed to speak to him. One day, as Monsieur de Saint-Mars was conversing with him, standing outside his door, in a kind of corridor, so as to be able to see from a distance everyone who approached, the son of one of the governor's friends, hearing the voices, came up. Saint-Mars quickly closed the door of the room, and rushing to meet the young man, asked him with an air of great anxiety if he had overheard anything that was said. Having convinced himself that he had heard nothing, the governor sent the young man away the same day, and wrote to the father that the adventure was like to have cost the son dear, and that he had sent him back to his home to prevent any further imprudence. I was curious enough to visit the room in which the unfortunate man was imprisoned on the 2nd of February 1778. It is lighted by one window to the north, overlooking the sea, about 15 feet above the terrace where the sentries paced to and fro. This window was pierced through a very thick wall, and the embrasure barricaded by 3 iron bars, thus separating the prisoner from the sentries by a distance of over 2 fathoms. I found an officer of the Free Company in the fortress, who was nigh on 80 years old. He told me that his father, who had belonged to the same company, had often related to him how a friar had seen something white floating on the water under the prisoner's window. On being fished out and carried to Monsieur de Saint-Mars, it proved to be a shirt of very fine material, loosely folded together, and covered with writing from end to end. Monsieur de Saint-Mars spread it out and read a few words. Then, turning to the friar who had brought it, he asked him in an embarrassed manner if he had been led by curiosity to read any of the writing. The friar protested repeatedly that he had not read a line, but nevertheless he was found dead in bed 2 days later. This incident was told so often to my informant by his father and by the chaplain of the fort at that time that he regarded it as incontestably true. The following fact also appears to me to be equally well established by the testimony of many witnesses. I collected all the evidence I could on the spot, and also in the Lorraine monastery, where the tradition is preserved. A female attendant being wanted for the prisoner, a woman of the village of Mangin offered herself for the place, being under the impression that she would thus be able to make her children's fortune. But on being told that she would not only never be allowed to see her children again, but would be cut off from the rest of the world as well, she refused to be shut up with the prisoner whom it cost so much to serve. I may mention here that at the 2 outer angles of the wall of the fort which faced the sea, 2 sentries were placed, with orders to fire on any boat which approached within a certain distance. The prisoner's personal attendant died in the Ile Sainte-Marguerite. The brother of the officer whom I mentioned above was partly in the confidence of Monsieur de Saint-Mars, and he often told how he was summoned to the prison once at midnight and ordered to remove a corpse, and that he carried it on his shoulders to the burial place, feeling certain it was the prisoner who was dead. But it was only his servant, and it was then that an effort was made to supply his place by a female attendant. Abbé Pepin gives some curious details, hitherto unknown to the public, but as he mentions no names, his narrative cannot be considered as evidence. Voltaire never replied to Lagrange Chancel, who died the same year in which his letter was published. Freron, desiring to revenge himself for the scathing portrait which Voltaire had drawn of him in the Écossaise, called to his assistance a more redoubtable adversary than Lagrange Chancel. Sainte-Foy had brought to the front a brand new theory, founded on a passage by Hume in an article in the Année Littéraire, 1768, Volume 4, in which he maintained that the man in the iron mask was the Duke of Monmouth, a natural son of Charles II, who was found guilty of high treason and beheaded in London on the 15th July, 1685. This is what the English historian says. It was commonly reported in London that the Duke of Monmouth's life had been saved, one of his adherents who bore a striking resemblance to the Duke having consented to die in his stead, while the real culprit was secretly carried off to France, there to undergo a lifelong imprisonment. End of Chapter 1, Part 2.
Chapter 1, Part 3 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Gillespie. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 1, Part 3. The great affection which the English felt for the Duke of Monmouth, and his own conviction that the people only needed a leader to induce them to shake off the yoke of James II, led him to undertake an enterprise which might possibly have succeeded had it been carried out with prudence. He landed at Lyme in Dorset with only 120 men. 6,000 soon gathered round his standard. A few towns declared in his favour. He caused himself to be proclaimed king, affirming that he was born in wedlock, and that he possessed the proofs of the secret marriage of Charles II and Lucy Waiters, his mother. He met the royalists on the battlefield, and victory seemed to be on his side when, just at the decisive moment, his ammunition ran short. Lord Grey, who commanded the cavalry, beat a cowardly retreat. The unfortunate Monmouth was taken prisoner, brought to London, and beheaded. The details published in the Siècle de Louis XIV as to the personal appearance of the masked prisoner might have been taken as a description of Monmouth, who possessed great physical beauty. Sainte-Foy had collected every scrap of evidence in favor of his solution of the mystery, making use even of the following passage from an anonymous romance called The Loves of Charles II and James II, Kings of England. The night of the pretended execution of the Duke of Monmouth, the king, attended by 3 men, came to the Tower and summoned the Duke to his presence. A kind of loose cowl was thrown over his head, and he was put into a carriage into which the king and his attendants also got, and was driven away. Sainte-Foy also referred to the alleged visit of Saunders, confessor to James II, paid to the Duchess of Portsmouth after the death of that monarch, when the Duchess took occasion to say that she could never forgive King James for consenting to Monmouth's execution, in spite of the oath he had taken on the sacred elements at the deathbed of Charles II, that he would never take his natural brother's life, even in case of rebellion. To this the priest replied quickly, the king kept his oath. Hume also records this solemn oath, but we cannot say that all the historians agree on this point. The Universal History by Guthrie and Gray and the Histoire d'Angleterre by Rapin, Thoyras, and de Barrow do not mention it. Further, wrote Sainte-Foy, an English surgeon called Nelliton, who frequented the Café Procope, much affected by men of letters, often related that during the time he was senior apprentice to a surgeon who lived near Port Saint-Antoine, he was once taken to the Bastille to bleed a prisoner. He was conducted to this prisoner's room by the governor himself, and found the patient suffering from violent headache. He spoke with an English accent, wore a gold-flowered dressing gown of black and orange, and had his face covered by a napkin knotted behind his head. The story does not hold water. It would be difficult to form a mask out of a napkin. The Bastille had a resident surgeon of its own, as well as a physician and apothecary. No one could gain access to a prisoner without a written order from a minister. Even the viaticum could only be introduced by express permission of the lieutenant of police. This theory met at first with no objections, and seemed to be going to oust all the others, thanks perhaps to the combative and restive character of its promulgator, who bore criticism badly, and whom no one cared to incense, his sword being even more redoubtable than his pen. It was known that when Saint-Mars journeyed with his prisoner to the Bastille, they had put up on the way at Palteau, in Champagne, a property belonging to the governor. Freron therefore addressed himself to a grand-nephew of Saint-Mars, who had inherited this estate, asking if he could give him any information about this visit. The following reply appeared in the Année littéraire, June 1768. As it appears from the letter of M. de Sainte-Foy, from which you quote that the man in the iron mask still exercises the fancy of your journalists, I am willing to tell you all I know about the prisoner. He was known in the islands of Sainte Marguerite and at the Bastille as La Tour. The governor and all the other officials showed him great respect and supplied him with everything he asked for that could be granted to a prisoner. He often took exercise in the yard of the prison, but never without his mask on. It was not till the Siècle of M. de Voltaire appeared that I learned that the mask was of iron and furnished with springs. It may be that the circumstance was overlooked, but he never wore it except when taking the air or when he had to appear before a stranger. M. de Blainvilliers, an infantry officer who was acquainted with M. de Sainte-Mars, both at Pignerol and Sainte Marguerite, has often told me that the lot of La Tour greatly excited his curiosity, and that he had once borrowed the clothes and arms of a soldier whose turn it was to be sentry on the terrace under the prisoner's window at Sainte Marguerite, and undertaken the duty himself, that he had seen the prisoner distinctly without his mask, that his face was white, that he was tall and well proportioned, except that his ankles were too thick, and that his hair was white, although he appeared to be still in the prime of life. He passed the whole of the night in question pacing to and fro in his room. Blainvilliers added that he was always dressed in brown, and that he had plenty of fine linen and books, and that the governor and the other officers always stood uncovered in his presence until he gave them leave to cover and sit down, and that they often bore him company at table. In 1698, M. de Saint-Mars was promoted from the governorship of the Ile Sainte-Marguerite to that of the Bastille. In moving thither, accompanied by his prisoner, he made his estate of Palteau a halting place. The masked man arrived in a litter which preceded that of M. de Saint-Mars, and several mounted men rode beside it. The peasants were assembled to greet their liege lord. M. de Saint-Mars dined with his prisoner, who sat with his back to the dining-room windows, which looked out on the court. None of the peasants whom I have questioned were able to see whether the man kept his mask on while eating, but they all noticed that M. de Saint-Mars, who sat opposite to his charge, laid 2 pistols beside his plate, that only one footman waited at table, who went into the antechamber to change the plates and dishes, always carefully closing the dining-room door behind him. When the prisoner crossed the courtyard, his face was covered with a black mask, but the peasants could see his lips and teeth and remarked that he was tall and had white hair. M. de Saint-Mars slept in a bed placed beside the prisoners. M. de Blainvilliers told me also that as soon as he was dead, which happened in 1704, he was buried at St. Paul's, and that the coffin was filled with substances which would rapidly consume the body. He added, "I never heard that the masked man spoke with an English accent." Sainte-Foy proved the story related by M. de Blainvilliers to be little worthy of belief, showing by a circumstance mentioned in the letter that the imprisoned man could not be the Duc de Beaufort. Witness the epigram of Madame de Choisy: M. de Beaufort longs to bite and can't, whereas the peasants had seen the prisoner's teeth through his mask. It appeared as if the theory of Sainte-Foy were going to stand when a Jesuit father named Guerre, who was confessor at the Bastille, devoted chapter 13 of his Traité différentes sortes de preuves qui servent à établir la vérité dans l'histoire to the consideration of the Iron Mask. He was the first to quote an authentic document which certifies that the man in the Iron Mask, about whom there was so much disputing, really existed. This was the written journal of M. du Jonca, King's Lieutenant in the Bastille in 1698, from which Père Griffet took the following passage. On Thursday, September the 8th, 1698, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, M. de Saint-Mars, the new governor of the Bastille, entered upon his duties. He arrived from the islands of Sainte Marguerite, bringing with him in a litter a prisoner whose name is a secret, and whom he had had under his charge there and at Pignerol. This prisoner, who was always masked, was at first placed in the Bassinere Tower, where he remained until the evening. At 9 o'clock p.m., I took him to the 3rd room of the Bertaudiere Tower, which I had already furnished before his arrival with all needful articles, having received orders to do so from M. de Saint-Mars. While I was showing him the way to his room, I was accompanied by M. Rosarget, who had also arrived along with M. de Saint-Mars, and whose office it was to wait on the said prisoner, whose table is to be supplied by the governor. Du Jonca's diary records the death of the prisoner in the following terms. Monday, 19th October, 1703. The unknown prisoner, who always wore a black velvet mask, and whom M. de Saint-Mars brought with him from the Ile Sainte-Marguerite, and whom he had so long in charge, felt slightly unwell yesterday on coming back from Mass. He died today at 10 p.m. without having a serious illness. Indeed, it could not have been slighter. M. Guerre, our chaplain, confessed him yesterday, but as his death was quite unexpected, he did not receive the last sacraments, although the chaplain was able to exhort him up to the moment of his death. He was buried on Tuesday, the 20th November, at 4 p.m. in the burial ground of St. Paul's, our parish church. The funeral expenses amounted to 40 livres. His name and age were withheld from the priests of the parish. The entry made in the parish register, which Père Guerre also gives, is in the following words. On the 19th November 1703, Marchiali, aged about 45, died in the Bastille, whose body was buried in the graveyard of St. Paul's, his parish, on the 20th instant, in the presence of M. Rosarget and of M. Riel, Surgeon Major of the Bastille. Signed, Rosarget, Riel. As soon as he was dead, everything belonging to him, without exception, was burned, such as his linen, clothes, bed and bedding, rugs, chairs, and even the doors of the room he occupied. His service of plate was melted down, the walls of his room were scoured and whitewashed, and the very floor was renewed from fear of his having hidden a note under it or left some mark by which he could be recognized. Père Guerre did not agree with the opinions of either Lagrange Chancel or Sainte-Foy, but seemed to incline toward the theory set forth in the Memoir de Perse, against which no irrefutable objections had been advanced. He concluded by saying that before arriving at any decision as to who the prisoner really was, it would be necessary to ascertain the exact date of his arrival at Pignerol. Sainte-Foy hastened to reply, upholding the soundness of the views he had advanced. He procured from Arras a copy of an entry in the registers of the cathedral chapter, stating that Louis XIV had written with his own hand to the said chapter that they were to admit to burial the body of the Comte de Vermandois, who had died in the city of Courtrai, that he desired that the deceased should be interred in the center of the choir, in the vault in which lay the remains of Elizabeth, Comtesse de Vermandois, wife of Philip of Alsace, Comte de Flanders, who had died in 1182. It is not to be supposed that Louis XIV would have chosen a family vault in which to bury a log of wood. Sainte-Foy was, however, not acquainted with the letter of Barbezieux dated the 13th August 1691, to which we have already referred as a proof that the prisoner was not the Comte de Vermandois. It is equally a proof that he was not the Duke of Monmouth, as Sainte-Foy maintained, for a sentence was passed on the Duke of Monmouth in 1685, so that it could not be of him either that Barbezieux wrote in 1691, the prisoner whom you have had in charge for 20 years. In the very year in which Sainte-Foy began to flatter himself that his theory was successfully established, Baron Heiss brought a new one forward in a letter dated Phalsbourg, 28th June 1770, and addressed to the Journal Encyclopédique. It was accompanied by a letter translated from the Italian, which appeared in the Histoire abrégée de l'Europe by Jacques Bernard, published by Claude Jordan, Leyden, 1685-87, in detached sheets. This letter stated that the Duke of Mantua, being desirous to sell his capital, Cassel, to the King of France, had been dissuaded therefrom by his secretary and induced to join the other princes of Italy in their endeavours to thwart the ambitious schemes of Louis XIV. The Marquis d'Arcy, French ambassador to the court of Savoy, having been informed of the secretary's influence, distinguished him by all kinds of civilities, asked him frequently to table, and at last invited him to join a large hunting party 2 or 3 leagues outside Turin. They set out together, but at a short distance from the city were surrounded by a dozen horsemen who carried off the secretary, disguised him, put a mask on him, and took him to Pignerol. He was not kept long in this fortress, as it was too near the Italian frontier, and although he was carefully guarded, it was feared that the walls would speak. So he was transferred to the Ile Sainte Marguerite, where he is at present in the custody of M. de Saint-Mars. This theory, of which much was heard later, did not at first excite much attention. What is certain is that the Duke of Mantua's secretary, by name Matthioli, was arrested in 1679 through the agency of the Abbé d'Estrades and M. de Catinat, and was taken with the utmost secrecy to Pignerol, where he was imprisoned and placed in charge of M. de Saint-Mars. He must not, however, be confounded with the man in the iron mask. Catinat says of Matthioli in a letter to Louvois, "No one knows the name of this knave." Louvois writes to Saint-Mars, "I admire your patience in waiting for an order to treat such a rogue as he deserves, when he treats you with disrespect." Saint-Mars replies to the minister, "I have charged Blainvilliers to show him a cudgel and tell him that with its aid we can make the froward meek." Again, Louvois writes, "The clothes of such people must be made to last 3 or 4 years." This cannot have been the nameless prisoner who was treated with such consideration, before whom Louvois stood bareheaded, who was supplied with fine linen and lace, and so on. Altogether, we gather from the correspondence of Saint-Mars that the unhappy man alluded to above was confined along with a mad Jacobin, and at last became mad himself, and succumbed to his misery in 1686. Voltaire, who was probably the first to supply such inexhaustible food for controversy, kept silence and took no part in the discussions. But when all the theories had been presented to the public, he set about refuting them. He made himself very merry in the 7th edition of Questions sur l'encyclopédie distribuée en forme de dictionnaire, over the complacence attributed to Louis XIV in acting as police sergeant and jailer for James II, William III, and Anne, with all of whom he was at war. Persisting still in taking 1661 or 1662 as the date when the incarceration of the masked prisoner began, he attacks the opinions advanced by Lagrange Chancel and Père Griffet, which they had drawn from the anonymous Memoir secret pour servir à l'histoire des Perses. Having thus dissipated all these illusions, he says, let us now consider who the masked prisoner was, and how old he was when he died. It is evident that if he was never allowed to walk in the courtyard of the Bastille, or to see a physician without his mask, it must have been lest his too striking resemblance to someone be remarked. He could show his tongue, but not his face. As regards his age, he himself told the apothecary at the Bastille, a few days before his death, that he thought he was about 60. This I have often heard from a son-in-law to this apothecary, M. Marcelin, surgeon to Marshal Richelieu, and afterward to the regent, the Duc d'Orléans. The writer of this article knows perhaps more on the subject than Père Griffet, but he has said his say. End of chapter 1. Chapter 1, Part 4 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Gillespie. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 1, Part 4. This article, in the Questions on the Encyclopedia, was followed by some remarks from the pen of the publisher, which are also, however, attributed by the publishers of Kiel to Voltaire himself. The publisher, who sometimes calls himself the author, puts aside without refutation all the theories advanced, including that of Baron Heiss, and says he has come to the conclusion that the Iron Mask was, without doubt, a brother and an elder brother of Louis XIV by a lover of the Queen. Anne of Austria had come to persuade herself that hers alone was the fault which had deprived Louis XIII of an heir. But the birth of the Iron Mask undeceived her. The cardinal, to whom she confided her secret, cleverly arranged to bring the king and queen, who had long lived apart, together again. A second son was the result of this reconciliation, and the first child being removed in secret, Louis XIV remained in ignorance of the existence of his half-brother till after his majority. It was the policy of Louis XIV to affect a great respect for the royal house, so he avoided much embarrassment to himself and the scandal affecting the memory of Anne of Austria by adopting the wise and just measure of burying alive the pledge of an adulterous love. He was thus enabled to avoid committing an act of cruelty which a sovereign less conscientious and less magnanimous would have considered a necessity. After this declaration, Voltaire made no further reference to the Iron Mask. This last version of the story upset that of Sainte-Foy. Voltaire, having been initiated into the state secret by the Marquis de Richelieu, we may be permitted to suspect that, being naturally indiscreet, he published the truth from behind the shelter of a pseudonym, or at least gave a version which approached the truth, but later on, realizing the dangerous significance of his words, he preserved for the future complete silence. We now approach the question whether the prince, who thus became the Iron Mask, was an illegitimate brother or a twin brother of Louis XIV. The first was maintained by M. Quentin Crawford, the second by Abbé Soulavie in his Memoirs du Maréchal Duc de Richelieu. In 1783, the Marquis de Luchet, in the Journal des Gens du Monde, awarded to Buckingham the honor of the paternity in dispute. In support of this, he quoted the testimony of a lady of the house of Saint Quentin, who had been a mistress of the minister Barbezieux, and who died at Chartres about the middle of the 18th century. She had declared publicly that Louis XIV had consigned his elder brother to perpetual imprisonment, and that the mask was necessitated by the close resemblance of the two brothers to each other. The Duke of Buckingham, who came to France in 1625 in order to escort Henrietta Maria, sister of Louis XIII, to England, where she was to marry the Prince of Wales, made no secret of his ardent love for the Queen, and it is almost certain that she was not insensible to his passion. An anonymous pamphlet, La Conférence du Cardinal Mazarin avec la Gazetière, says that she was infatuated about him and allowed him to visit her in her room. She even permitted him to take off and keep one of her gloves, and his vanity leading him to show his spoil, the king heard of it and was vastly offended. An anecdote, the truth of which no one has ever denied, relates that one day Buckingham spoke to the Queen with such passion in the presence of her lady-in-waiting, the Marquise de Senecey, that the latter exclaimed, "Be silent, sir, you cannot speak thus to the Queen of France." According to this version, The man in the iron mask must have been born at latest in 1637. But the mention of any such date would destroy the possibility of Buckingham's paternity, for he was assassinated at Portsmouth on September 2nd, 1628. After the taking of the Bastille, the masked prisoner became the fashionable topic of discussion, and one heard of nothing else. On the 13th of August, 1789, it was announced in an article in a journal called Loisir d'un Patriote Français, which was afterward published anonymously as a pamphlet, that the publisher had seen, among other documents found in the Bastille, a card bearing the unintelligible number 6438900, and the following note: Fouquet, arriving from Les Îles Sainte Marguerite in an iron mask. To this there was, it was said, a double signature, viz. XXX, superimposed on the name Kersadion. The journalist was of opinion that Fouquet had succeeded in making his escape, but had been retaken and condemned to pass for dead, and to wear a mask henceforward as a punishment for his attempted evasion. This tale made some impression, for it was remembered that in the supplement to the Siècle de Louis XIV, it was stated that Chamillard had said that the Iron Mask was a man who knew all the secrets of M. Fouquet. But the existence of this card was never proven, and we cannot accept a story on the unsupported word of an anonymous writer. From the time that restrictions on the press were removed, hardly a day passed without the appearance of some new pamphlet on the Iron Mask. Louis Dutens, in Correspondence Interceptée, revived the theory of Baron Heiss, supporting it by new and curious facts. He proved that Louis XIV had really ordered one of the Duc de Mantua's ministers to be carried off and imprisoned in Pignerol. Dutens gave the name of the victim as Girolamo Magni. He also quoted from a memorandum, which, by the wish of the Marquis de Castellane, was drawn up by a certain Souchon, probably the man whom Papin questioned in 1778. This Souchon was the son of a man who had belonged to the free company maintained in the islands in the time of Saint-Mars, and was 79 years old. This memorandum gives a detailed account of the abduction of a minister in 1679, who was styled a minister of the empire, and his arrival as a masked prisoner at the islands, and states that he died there in captivity 9 years after he was carried off. Dutens thus divests the episode of the element of the marvelous with which Voltaire had surrounded it. He called to his aid the testimony of the Duc de Choiseul, who, having in vain attempted to worm the secret of the Iron Mask out of Louis XV, begged Madame de Pompadour to try her hand, and was told by her that the prisoner was the minister of an Italian prince. At the same time that Dutens wrote, "There is no fact in history better established than the fact that the man in the Iron Mask was a minister of the Duke of Mantua, who was carried off from Turin." M. Quentin Crawford was maintaining that the prisoner was the son of Anne of Austria, while a few years earlier Boucher, a lawyer, in his Essai sur l'histoire de Provence, had regarded this story as a fable invented by Voltaire, and had convinced himself that the prisoner was a woman. As we see, discussion threw no light on the subject, and instead of being dissipated, the confusion became ever worse confounded. In 1790, the Memoir du Maréchal de Richelieu appeared. He had left his notebooks, his library, and his correspondence to Soulavie. The memoirs are undoubtedly authentic, and have, if not certainty, at least a strong moral presumption in their favour, and gained the belief of men holding diverse opinions. But before placing under the eyes of our readers extracts from them relating to the Iron Mask. Let us refresh our memory by recalling two theories which had not stood the test of thorough investigation. According to some MS notes left by M. de Bonac, French ambassador at Constantinople in 1724, the Armenian patriarch Arwedicks, a mortal enemy of our church and the instigator of the terrible persecutions to which the Roman Catholics were subjected, was carried off into exile at the request of the Jesuits by a French vessel, and confined in a prison whence there was no escape. This prison was the fortress of Sainte Marguerite, and from there he was taken to the Bastille, where he died. The Turkish government continually clamored for his release till 1723, but the French government persistently denied having taken any part in the abduction. Even if it were not a matter of history that Arwedicks went over to the Roman Catholic Church and died a free man in Paris, as may be seen by an inspection of the certificate of his death preserved among the archives in the Foreign Office, one sentence from the notebook of M. de Bonac would be sufficient to annihilate this theory. M. de Bonac says that the patriarch was carried off, while M. de Ferriol, who succeeded M. de Chateauneuf in 1699, was ambassador at Constantinople. Now it was in 1698 that Saint-Mars arrived at the Bastille with his masked prisoner. Several English scholars have sided with Gibbon in thinking that the man in the Iron Mask might possibly have been Henry, the second son of Oliver Cromwell, who was held as a hostage by Louis XIV. By an odd coincidence, the second son of Lord Protector does not entirely disappear from the page of history in 1659. We know nothing of where he afterward lived, nor where he died. But why should he be a prisoner of state in France, while his elder brother Richard was permitted to live there quite openly? In the absence of all proof, we cannot attach the least importance to this explanation of the mystery. We now come to the promised extracts of the Memoirs de Maréchal de Richelieu. Under the late king, there was a time when every class of society was asking who the famous personage really was who went by the name of the Iron Mask. But I noticed that this curiosity abated somewhat after his arrival at the Bastille with Saint-Mars, when it began to be reported that orders had been given to kill him should he let his name be known. Saint-Mars also let it be understood that whoever found out the secret would share the same fate. This threat to murder both the prisoner and those who showed too much curiosity about him made such an impression that during the lifetime of the late king, people only spoke of the mystery below their breath. The anonymous author of Les Mémoires de Perse, which were published in Holland 15 years after the death of Louis XIV, was the first who dared to speak publicly of the prisoner and relate some anecdotes about him. Since the publication of that work, liberty of speech and the freedom of the press have made great strides. In the shade of Louis XIV having lost its terrors, the case of the Iron Mask is freely discussed, and yet even now, at the end of my life and 70 years after the death of a king, people are still asking who the man in the Iron Mask really was. This question was one I put to the adorable princess, beloved of the regent, who inspired in return only aversion and respect, all her love being given to me. As everyone was persuaded that the regent knew the name, the course of life, and the cause of the imprisonment of the masked prisoner, I, being more venturesome in my curiosity than others, tried through my princess to fathom the secret. She had hitherto constantly repulsed the advances of the Duc d'Orléans, but as the ardor of his passion was thereby in no wise abated, the least glimpse of hope would be sufficient to induce him to grant her everything she asked. I persuaded her, therefore, to let him understand that if he would allow her to read the Memoirs du Masque, which were in his possession, his dearest desires would be fulfilled. The Duc d'Orléans had never been known to reveal any secret of state, being unspeakably circumspect, and having been trained to keep every confidence inviolable by his preceptor Dubois. So I felt quite certain that even the princess would fail in her efforts to get a sight of the memoranda in his possession relative to the birth and rank of the masked prisoner. But what cannot love, and such an ardent love, induce a man to do? To reward her goodness, the regent gave the documents into her hands, and she forwarded them to me next day, enclosed in a note written in cipher, which, according to the laws of historical writing, I reproduce in its entirety, vouching for its authenticity, for the princess always employed a cipher when she used the language of gallantry, and this note told me what treaty she had to sign in order that she might obtain the documents, and the Duke the desire of his heart. The details are not admissible in serious history, but borrowing the modest language of the patriarchal time, I may say that if Jacob, before he obtained possession of the best beloved of Laban's daughters, was obliged to pay the price twice over, the regent drove a better bargain than the patriarch. The note and the memorandum were as follows: 2-1-17-12-9-2-20, 2-1-7-14-20, 10-3, 21, 1, 11, 14, 1, 15, 16, 12, 17, 14, 2, 1, 21, 11, 20, 17, 12, 9, 14, 9, 2, 8, 20, 5, 20, 2, 2, 17, 8, 1, 2, 20, 9, 21, 21, 1, 5, 12, 17, 15, 0, 0, 14, 1, 15, 14, 12, 9, 21, 5, 12, 9, 21, 16, 20, 14, 8, 3. Narrative of the birth and education of the unfortunate prince who was separated from the world by Cardinals Richelieu and Mazarin and imprisoned by order of Louis XIV. Drawn up by the governor of this prince on his deathbed. The unfortunate prince whom I brought up and had in charge till almost the end of my life was born on the 5th September 1638 at 8:30 o'clock in the evening, while the king was at supper. His brother, who is now on the throne, was born at noon while the king was at dinner. But whereas his birth was splendid and public, that of his brother was sad and secret. For the king, being informed by the midwife that the queen was about to give birth to a second child, ordered the chancellor, the midwife, the chief almoner, the queen's confessor, and myself to stay in her room to be witnesses of whatever happened, and of his course of action should a second child be born. For a long time already it had been foretold to the king that his wife would give birth to 2 sons, and some days before, certain shepherds had arrived in Paris, saying they were divinely inspired, so that it was said in Paris that if 2 dauphins were born, it would be the greatest misfortune which could happen to the state. The Archbishop of Paris summoned these soothsayers before him and ordered them to be imprisoned in Saint Lazare, because the populace was becoming excited about them, a circumstance which filled the king with care, as he foresaw much trouble to his kingdom. What had been predicted by the soothsayers happened, whether they had really been warned by the constellations, or whether Providence, by whom his majesty had been warned of the calamities which might happen to France, interposed. The king had sent a messenger to the cardinal to tell him of this prophecy, and the cardinal had replied that the matter must be considered, that the birth of 2 dauphins was not impossible, and should such a case arrive, the second must be carefully hidden away, lest in the future, desiring to be king, he should fight against his brother in support of a new branch of the royal house, and come at last to reign. The king in his suspense felt very uncomfortable, and as the queen began to utter cries, we feared a second confinement. We sent to inform the king, who was almost overcome by the thought that he was about to become a father of 2 dauphins. He said to the Bishop of Meaux, whom he had sent for to minister to the queen, "Do not quit my wife till she is safe. I am in mortal terror." Immediately after he summoned us all, the Bishop of Meaux, the Chancellor M. Honorat, Dame Perronnette the midwife, and myself, and said to us in presence of the queen, so that she could hear, that we would answer to him with our heads if we made known the birth of a second dauphin; that it was his will that the fact should remain a state secret, to prevent the misfortunes which would else happen, the Salic law not having declared to whom the inheritance of the kingdom should come in case 2 eldest sons were born to any of the kings. What had been foretold happened. The queen, while the king was at supper, gave birth to a second dauphin, more dainty and more beautiful than the first, but who wept and wailed unceasingly, as if he regretted to take up that life in which he was afterward to endure such suffering. The chancellor drew up the report of this wonderful birth, without parallel in our history, but his majesty, not being pleased with its form, burned it in our presence, and the chancellor had to write and rewrite till his majesty was satisfied. The almoner remonstrated, saying that it would be impossible to hide the birth of a prince, but the king returned that he had reasons of state for all he did. Afterward, the king made us register our oath, the chancellor signing it first, then the queen's confessor, and I last. The oath was also signed by the surgeon and midwife who attended on the queen, and the king attached this document to the report, taking both away with him, and I never heard any more of either. I remember that his majesty consulted with the chancellor as to the form of the oath, and that he spoke for a long time in an undertone to the cardinal, after which the last born child was given into the charge of the midwife, and as they were always afraid she would babble about his birth, she has told me that they often threatened her with death should she ever mention it. We were also forbidden to speak, even to each other, of the child whose birth we had witnessed. Not one of us has as yet violated his oath, for his majesty dreaded nothing so much as a civil war brought about by the 2 children born together, and the cardinal, who afterward got the care of the second child into his hands, kept that fear alive. The king also commanded us to examine the unfortunate prince minutely. He had a wart above the left elbow, a mole on the right side of his neck, and a tiny wart on his right thigh. For his majesty was determined, and rightly so, that in case of the decease of the firstborn, the royal infant, whom he was entrusting to our care, should take his place. Wherefore he required our signed manual to the report of the birth, to which a small royal seal was attached in our presence, and we all signed it after his majesty, according as he commanded. As to the shepherds who had foretold the double birth, never did I hear another word of them, but neither did I inquire. The cardinal who took the mysterious infant in charge probably got them out of the country. All through the infancy of the second prince, Dame Perronnette treated him as if he were her own child, giving out that his father was a great nobleman, for everyone saw by the care she lavished on him and the expense she went to, that although unacknowledged, he was the cherished son of rich parents, and well cared for. When the prince began to grow up, Cardinal Mazarin, who succeeded Cardinal Richelieu in the charge of the prince's education, gave him into my hands to bring up in a manner worthy of a king's son, but in secret. Dame Perronnette continued in his service till her death, and was very much attached to him, and he still more to her. The prince was instructed in my house in Burgundy, with all the care due to the son and brother of a king. End of chapter 1, part 4. Chapter 1, part 5 of Celebrated Crimes, volume 6, part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Gillespie. Celebrated Crimes, volume 6, part 2, by Alexandre Dumas, chapter 1, part 5. I had several conversations with the Queen Mother during the troubles in France, and Her Majesty always seemed to fear that if the existence of the prince should be discovered during the lifetime of his brother, the young king, malcontents would make it a pretext for rebellion, because many medical men hold that the last born of twins is in reality the elder, and if so, he was king by right, while many others have a different opinion. In spite of this dread, the queen could never bring herself to destroy the written evidence of his birth, because in case of the death of the young king, she intended to have his twin brother proclaimed. She told me often that the written proofs were in her strong-box. I gave the ill-starred prince such an education as I should have liked to receive myself, and no acknowledged son of a king ever had a better. The only thing for which I have to reproach myself is that, without intending it, I caused him great unhappiness, for when he was 19 years old, he had a burning desire to know who he was, and as he saw that I was determined to be silent, growing more firm the more he tormented me with questions, he made up his mind henceforward to disguise his curiosity and make me think that he believed himself a love-child of my own. He began to call me father, although when we were alone, I often assured him that he was mistaken. But at length I gave up combating this belief, which he perhaps only feigned to make me speak, and allowed him to think he was my son, contradicting him no more. But while he continued to dwell on this subject, he was meantime making every effort to find out who he really was. 2 years passed thus, when, through an unfortunate piece of forgetfulness on my part, for which I greatly blame myself, he became acquainted with the truth. He knew that the king had lately sent me several messengers, and once having carelessly forgotten to lock up a casket containing letters from the queen and the cardinals, he read part and divined the rest through his natural intelligence, and later confessed to me that he had carried off the letter which told most explicitly of his birth. I can recall that from this time on his manner to me showed no longer that respect for me in which I had brought him up, but became hectoring and rude, and that I could not imagine the reason for the change, for I never found out that he had searched my papers, and he never revealed to me how he got at the casket, whether he was aided by some workmen whom he did not wish to betray, or had employed other means. One day, however, he unguardedly asked me to show him the portraits of the late and the present king. I answered that those that existed were so poor that I was waiting till better ones were taken before having them in my house. This answer, which did not satisfy him, called forth the request to be allowed to go to Dijon. I found out afterward that he wanted to see a portrait of the king which was there, and to get to the court, which was just then at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, because of the approaching marriage with the Infanta, so that he might compare himself with his brother and see if there were any resemblance between them. Having knowledge of his plan, I never let him out of my sight. The young prince was at this time as beautiful as Cupid, and through the intervention of Cupid himself, he succeeded in getting hold of a portrait of his brother. One of the upper servants of the house, a young girl, had taken his fancy, and he lavished such caresses on her and inspired her with so much love that although the whole household was strictly forbidden to give him anything without my permission, she procured him a portrait of the king. The unhappy prince saw the likeness at once, indeed no one could help seeing it, for the one portrait would serve equally well for either brother, and the sight produced such a fit of fury that he came to me crying out, "There is my brother, and this tells me who I am," holding out a letter from Cardinal Mazarin, which he had stolen from me, and making a great commotion in my house. The dread lest the prince should escape and succeed in appearing at the marriage of his brother made me so uneasy that I sent off a messenger to the king to tell him that my casket had been opened and asking for instructions. The king sent back word through the cardinal that we were both to be shut up till further orders, and that the prince was to be made to understand that the cause of our common misfortune was his absurd claim. I have since shared his prison, but I believe that a decree of release has arrived from my heavenly judge, and for my soul's health and for my ward's sake, I make this declaration, that he may know what measures to take in order to put an end to his ignominious estate should the king die without children. Can any oath imposed under threats oblige one to be silent about such incredible events, which is nevertheless necessary that posterity should know? Such were the contents of the historical document given by the regent to the princess, and it suggests a crowd of questions. Who was the prince's governor? Was he a Burgundian? Was he simply a landed proprietor with some property in the country house in Burgundy? How far was his estate from Dijon? He must have been a man of note, for he enjoyed the most intimate confidence at the court of Louis XIII, either by virtue of his office or because he was a favorite of the king, the queen, and Cardinal Richelieu. Can we learn from the list of the nobles of Burgundy what member of their body disappeared from public life, along with a young ward whom he had brought up in his own house just after the marriage of Louis XIV? Why did he not attach his signature to the declaration, which appears to be 100 years old? Did he dictate it when so near death that he had not strength to sign it? How did it find its way out of prison? And so forth. There is no answer to all these questions, and I, for my part, cannot undertake to affirm that the document is genuine. Abbe Soulavie relates that he one day pressed the marshal for an answer to some questions on the matter, asking, amongst other things, if it were not true that the prisoner was an elder brother of Louis XIV, born without the knowledge of Louis XIII. The marshal appeared very much embarrassed, and although he did not entirely refuse to answer, what he said was not very explanatory. He averred that this important personage was neither the illegitimate brother of Louis XIV, nor the Duke of Monmouth, nor the Comte de Vermandois, nor the Duc de Beaufort, and so on, as so many writers had asserted. He called all their writings mere inventions, but added that almost every one of them had got hold of some true incidents, as for instance the order to kill the prisoner should he make himself known. Finally, he acknowledged that he knew the state secret and used the following words: "All that I can tell you, Abbe, is that when the prisoner died at the beginning of the century, at a very advanced age, he had ceased to be of such importance as when, at the beginning of his reign, Louis XIV shut him up for weighty reasons of state." The above was written down under the eyes of the marshal, and when Abbe Soulavie entreated him to say something further, which, while not actually revealing the secret, would yet satisfy his questioner's curiosity, the Marshal answered, "Read M. de Voltaire's latest writings on the subject, especially his concluding words, and reflect on them." With the exception of Dulard, all the critics have treated Soulavie's narrative with the most profound contempt. And we must confess that if it was an invention, it was a monstrous one, and that the concoction of the famous note in cipher was abominable. Such was the great secret. In order to find out, I had to allow myself 5, 12, 17, 15, 14, 1, 3 times by 8, 3. But unfortunately for those who would defend the morals of Mademoiselle de Valois, it would be difficult to traduce the character of herself, her lover, and her father, for what one knows of the trio justifies one in believing that the more infamous the conduct imputed to them, the more likely it is to be true. We cannot see the force of the objection that Lavoie would not have written in the following terms to Saint-Mars in 1687 about a bastard son of Anne of Austria. "I see no objection to your removing Chevalier de Thezou from the prison in which he is confined, and putting your prisoner there till the one you are preparing for him is ready to receive him." And we cannot understand those who ask if Saint-Mars, following the example of the minister, would have said of a prince, "Until he is installed in the prison which is being prepared for him here, which has a chapel adjoining." Why should he have expressed himself otherwise? Does it evidence an abatement of consideration to call a prisoner and his prison a prison? A certain M. de Saint-Mihiel published an 8vo volume in 1791 at Strasbourg and Paris, entitled Le véritable homme, dit au masque de feu, ouvrage dans lequel on fait connaître sur preuve incontestable à que le célébré infortune tout le jour quand et où il naquit. The wording of the title will give an idea of the bizarre and barbarous jargon in which the whole book is written. It would be difficult to imagine the vanity and self-satisfaction which inspire this new reader of riddles. If he had found the philosopher's stone or made a discovery which would transform the world, he could not exhibit more pride and pleasure. All things considered, the incontestable proofs of his theory do not decide the question definitely, or place it above all attempts at refutation, any more than does the evidence on which the other theories which preceded and followed his rest. But what he lacks before all other things is the talent for arranging and using his materials. With the most ordinary skill, he might have evolved a theory which would have defied criticism at least as successfully as the others, and he might have supported it by proofs, which if not incontestable, for no one has produced such, had at least moral presumption in their favour, which has great weight in such a mysterious and obscure affair. In trying to explain, which one can never leave on one side, the respect shown by Lavoie to the prisoner, to whom he always spoke standing and with uncovered head. According to M. Saint-Mihiel, the man in the iron mask was a legitimate son of Anne of Austria and Mazarin. He avers that Mazarin was only a deacon and not a priest. When he became cardinal, having never taken priest's orders, according to the testimony of the Princess Palatine, consort of Philip I, Duc d'Orléans, and that it was therefore possible for him to marry, and that he did marry, Anne of Austria in secret. Old Madame Beauvais, principal woman of the bedchamber to the Queen Mother, knew of this ridiculous marriage, and as the price of her secrecy, obliged the Queen to comply with all her whims. To this circumstance, the principal bedchamber women owe the extensive privileges accorded them ever since in this country. The Queen Mother, consort of Louis XIII, had done worse than simply to fall in love with Mazarin. She had married him, for he had never been an ordained priest. He had only taken deacon's orders. If he had been a priest, his marriage would have been impossible. He grew terribly tired of the good Queen Mother, and did not live happily with her, which was only what he deserved for making such a marriage. She, the Queen Mother, was quite easy in her conscience about Cardinal Mazarin. He was not in priest's orders, and so could marry. The secret passage by which he reached the Queen's rooms every evening still exists in the Palais Royal. The Queen's manner of conducting affairs is influenced by the passion which dominates her. When she and the Cardinal converse together, their ardent love for each other is betrayed by their looks and gestures. It is plain to see that when obliged to part for a time, they do it with great reluctance. If what people say is true, that they are properly married, and that their union has been blessed by Père Vincent, the missioner, there is no harm in all that goes on between them, either in public or in private. The man in the iron mask told the apothecary in the Bastille that he thought he was about 60 years of age. Thus, he must have been born in 1644, just at the time when Anne of Austria was invested with the royal power, though it was really exercised by Mazarin. Can we find any incident recorded in history which lends support to the supposition that Anne of Austria had a son whose birth was kept as secret as her marriage to Mazarin? In 1644, Anne of Austria, being dissatisfied with her apartments in the Louvre, moved to the Palais Royal, which had been left to the king by Richelieu. Shortly after taking up residence there, she was very ill with a severe attack of jaundice, which was caused, in the opinion of the doctors, by worry, anxiety, and overwork, and which pulled her down greatly. This anxiety, caused by the pressure of public business, was most probably only dwelt on as a pretext for a pretended attack of illness. Anne of Austria had no cause for worry and anxiety until 1649. She did not begin to complain of the despotism of Mazarin till toward the end of 1645. She went frequently to the theatre during her first year of widowhood, but took care to hide herself from view in her box. Abbe Soulavie, in volume 6 of the Memoires de Richelieu, published in 1793, controverted the opinions of M. de Saint-Mihiel, and again advanced those which he had published some time before, supporting them by a new array of reasons. The fruitlessness of research in the archives of the Bastille, and the importance of the political events which were happening, diverted the attention of the public for some years from the subject. In the year 1800, however, the Magasin Encyclopédique published an article entitled Mémoires sur le problème historique et la méthode de la résoudre appliquée à celui qui concerne l'homme au masque de fer, signed C.D.O., in which the author maintained that the prisoner was the first minister of the Duke of Mantua, and says that his name was Girolamo Magni. In the same year, an octavo, a volume of 142 pages, was produced by M. Rouve Fazelac. It bore the title Recherches historiques et critiques sur l'homme au masque de fer du résultant des notions certaines sur ces prisonniers. These researches brought to light a secret correspondence relative to certain negotiations and intrigues, and to the abduction of a secretary of the Duke of Mantua, whose name was Matthioli, and not Girolamo Magni. In 1802, an octavo pamphlet containing 11 pages, of which the author was perhaps Baron Levier, but which was signed Reth, was published. It took the form of a letter to General Jourdan, and was dated from Turin, and gave many details about Matthioli and his family. It was entitled Véritable clef de l'historique de l'homme au masque de fer. It proved that the secretary of the Duke of Mantua was carried off, masked, and imprisoned by order of Louis XIV in 1679. But it did not succeed in establishing as an undoubted fact that the secretary and the man in the iron mask were one and the same person. It may be remembered that M. Crawford, writing in 1798, had said in his L'Histoire de la Bastille, "I cannot doubt that the man in the iron mask was the son of Anne of Austria, but am unable to decide whether he was a twin brother of Louis XIV, or was born while the king and queen lived apart, or during her widowhood." M. Crawford, in his Mélange de l'histoire et de littérature tirées d'un portefeuille, demolished the theory advanced by Ruz Fazilak. In 1825, M. Delors discovered in the archives several letters relating to Matthioli and published his Histoire de l'homme au masque de fer. This work was translated into English by George Agar Ellis and retranslated into French in 1830 under the title Histoire authentique du prisonnier d'État connaissant le nom de masque de fer. It is in this work that the suggestion is made that the captive was the second son of Oliver Cromwell. In 1826, M. de Toul wrote that in his opinion the masked prisoner was none other than the Armenian patriarch. But 6 years later, the great success of my drama at the Odeon converted nearly everyone to the version which Soulevy was the chief exponent. The bibliophile Jacob is mistaken in asserting that I followed a tradition preserved in the family of the Duc de Choiseul. M. le Duc de Bassano sent me a copy made under his personal supervision of a document drawn up for Napoleon, containing the results of some researches made by his orders on the subject of the man in the iron mask. The original MS, as well as that of the Memoir de Duc de Richelieu, were, the Duke told me, kept at the Foreign Office. In 1834, the Journal of the Institut Historique published a letter from M. Auguste Billiard, who stated that he had also made a copy of this document for the late Comte de Montalivet, Home Secretary under the Empire. M. Dufay gave his Histoire de la Bastille to the World in same year and was inclined to believe that the prisoner was a son of Buckingham. Besides the many important personages on whom the famous mask had been placed, there was one whom everyone had forgotten, although his name had been put forward by the minister Chamillard. This was the celebrated superintendent of finance, Nicolas Fouquet. In 1837, Jacob, armed with documents and extracts, once more occupied himself with this Chinese puzzle on which so much ingenuity had been lavished, but of which no one had as yet got all the pieces into their places. Let us see if he succeeded better than his forerunners. The first feeling he awakes is one of surprise. It seems odd he should again bring up the case of Fouquet, who was condemned to imprisonment for life in 1664, confined in Pignerol under the care of Saint-Mars, and whose death was announced, falsely according to Jacob, on March 23rd, 1680. The first thing to look for in trying to get at the true history of the mask is a sufficient reason of state to account for the persistent concealment of the prisoner's features till his death, and next, an explanation of the respect shown him by Louvois, whose attitude toward him would have been extraordinary in any age, but was doubly so during the reign of Louis XIV, whose courtiers would have been the last persons in the world to render homage to the misfortunes of a man in disgrace with their master. Whatever the real motive of the king's anger against Fouquet may have been, whether Louis thought he arrogated to himself too much power or aspired to rival his master in the hearts of some of the king's mistresses, or even presumed to raise his eyes higher still, was not the utter ruin, the lifelong captivity of his enemy enough to satiate the vengeance of the king? What could he desire more? Why should his anger, which seemed slaked in 1664, burst forth into hotter flames 17 years later and lead him to inflict a new punishment? According to the bibliophile, the king, being wearied by the continual petitions for pardon addressed to him by the superintendent's family, ordered them to be told that he was dead, to rid himself of their supplications. Colbert's hatred, he said, was the immediate cause of Fouquet's fall. But even if this hatred hastened the catastrophe, are we to suppose that it pursued the delinquent beyond the sentence, through the long years of captivity, and renewing its energy infected the minds of the king and his counselors? If that were so, how shall we explain the respect shown by Louvois? Colbert would not have stood uncovered before Fouquet in prison. Why should Colbert's colleague have done so? It must, however, be confessed that of all existing theories, this one, thanks to the unlimited learning and research of the bibliophile, has the greatest number of documents with the various interpretations thereof, the greatest profusion of dates on its side. For it is certain, first, that the precautions taken when Fouquet was sent to Pignerol resembled in every respect those employed later by the custodians of the Iron Mask, both at the Ile Sainte-Marguerite and at the Bastille. Second, that the majority of the traditions relative to the masked prisoner might apply to Fouquet. Third, that the Iron Mask was first heard of immediately after the announcement of the death of Fouquet in 1680. Fourth, that there exists no irrefragable proof that Fouquet's death really occurred in the above year. The decree of the Court of Justice, dated 20th December 1664, banished Fouquet from the kingdom for life. But the king was of the opinion that it would be dangerous to let the said Fouquet leave the country, in consideration of his intimate knowledge of the most important matters of state. Consequently, the sentence of perpetual banishment was commuted into that of perpetual imprisonment. The instructions signed by the king and remitted to Saint-Mars forbid him to permit Fouquet to hold any spoken or written communication with anyone whatsoever, or to leave his apartments for any cause, not even for exercise. The great mistrust felt by Louvois pervades all his letters to Saint-Mars. The precautions which he ordered to be kept up were quite as stringent as in the case of the Iron Mask. The report of the discovery of a shirt covered with writing by a friar, which Abbé Papin mentions, may perhaps be traced to the following extracts from 2 letters written by Louvois to Saint-Mars. Your letter has come to hand with a new handkerchief on which M. Fouquet has written. You can tell him that if he continues to employ his table linen as notepaper, he must not be surprised if you refuse to supply him with any more. Père Papin asserts that a valet who served the masked prisoner died in his master's room. Now the man who waited on Fouquet, and who, like him, was sentenced to lifelong imprisonment, died in February 1680. Echoes of incidents which took place at Pignerol might have reached the Ile Sainte-Marguerite when Saint-Mars transferred his former prisoner from one fortress to the other. The fine clothes and linen, the books, all those luxuries, in fact, that were lavished on the masked prisoner, were not withheld from Fouquet. The furniture of a second room at Pignerol cost over 1,200 livres. It is also known that until the year 1680, Saint-Mars had only 2 important prisoners at Pignerol, Fouquet and Lauzun. However, his former prisoner of Pignerol, according to Du Jonca's diary, must have reached the latter fortress before the end of August 1681, when Saint-Mars went to exile as governor. So that it was in the interval between the 23rd of March 1680, the alleged date of Fouquet's death, and the 1st of September 1681 that the Iron Mask appeared at Pignerol. And yet Saint-Mars took only 2 prisoners to exile. One of these was probably the man in the Iron Mask. The other, who must have been Matthioli, died before the year 1687. For when Saint-Mars took over the governorship in the month of January of that year of the Ile Sainte-Marguerite, he brought only 1 prisoner thither with him. I have taken such good measures to guard my prisoner that I can answer to you for his safety. In the correspondence of Louvois with Saint-Mars, we find, it is true, mention of the death of Fouquet on March 23, 1680, but in his later correspondence, Louvois never says the late M. Fouquet, but speaks of him as usual as M. Fouquet, simply. Most historians have given as a fact that Fouquet was interred in the same vault as his father in the chapel of Saint-François de Sales, in the convent church belonging to the Sisters of the Order of the Visitation Sainte Marie, founded in the beginning of the 17th century by Madame du Chantal. But proof to the contrary exists, for the subterranean portion of St. Francis Chapel was closed in 1786, the last person interred there being Adelaide Felicity Brouillard, with whom ended the house of Sillery. The convent was shut up in 1790, and the church given over to the Protestants in 1802, who continued to respect the tombs. In 1836, the cathedral chapter of Bourges claimed the remains of one of their archbishops buried there in the time of the Sisters Sainte Marie. On this occasion, all the coffins were examined and all the inscriptions carefully copied, but the name of Nicolas Fouquet is absent. Voltaire says in his Dictionnaire philosophique article, Anna, it is most remarkable that no one knows where the celebrated Fouquet was buried. But in spite of all these coincidences, this carefully constructed theory was wrecked on the same point on which the theory that the prisoner was either the Duke of Monmouth or the Comte de Vermandois came to grief, viz., a letter from Barbezieux, dated 13 August 1691, in which occur the words, "The prisoner whom you have had in charge for 20 years." According to this testimony, which Jacob had successfully used against his predecessors, the prisoner referred to could not have been Fouquet, who completed his 27th year of captivity in 1691, if still alive. We now have impartially set before our readers all the opinions which have been held in regard to the solution of this formidable enigma. For ourselves, we hold the belief that the man in the Iron Mask stood on the steps of the throne. Although the mystery cannot be said to be definitely cleared up, one thing stands out firmly established among the mass of conjecture we have collected together, and that is that wherever the prisoner appeared, he was ordered to wear a mask on pain of death. His features, therefore, might during half a century have brought about his recognition from one end of France to the other. Consequently, during the same space of time, there existed in France a face resembling the prisoner's known through all her provinces, even to her most secluded isle. Whose face could this be, if not that of Louis XIV, twin brother of the man in the Iron Mask? To nullify this simple and natural conclusion, strong evidence will be required. Our task has been limited to that of an examining judge at a trial, and we feel sure that our readers will not be sorry that we have left them to choose amid all the conflicting explanations of the puzzle. No consistent narrative that we might have concocted would, it seems to us, have been half as interesting to them as to allow them to follow the devious paths opened up by those who entered on the search for the heart of the mystery. Everything connected with the masked prisoner arouses the most vivid curiosity. And what end had we in view? Was it not to denounce a crime and to brand the perpetrator thereof? The facts as they stand are sufficient for our object, and speak more eloquently than if used to adorn a tale or to prove an ingenious theory. End of Chapter 1, Part 5. End of The Man in the Iron Mask, an essay.
Chapter 2, Part 1 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2 by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2 by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 2, Part 1. Martin Guerre. We are sometimes astonished at the striking resemblance existing between two persons who are absolute strangers to each other. But in fact it is the opposite which ought to surprise us. Indeed, why should we not rather admire a creative power so infinite in its variety that it never ceases to produce entirely different combinations with precisely the same elements? The more one considers this prodigious versatility of form, the more overwhelming it appears. To begin with, each nation has its own distinct and characteristic type, separating it from other races of men. Thus, there are the English, Spanish, German, or Slavonic types. Again, in each nation we find families distinguished from each other by less general but still well-pronounced features. And lastly, the individuals of each family differing again in more or less marked gradations. What a multitude of physiognomies! What variety of impression from the innumerable stamps of the human countenance! What millions of models and no copies! Considering this ever-changing spectacle, which ought to inspire us with most astonishment, the perpetual difference of faces or the accidental resemblance of a few individuals, is it impossible that in the whole wide world there should be found by chance two people whose features are cast in one and the same mold? Certainly not. Therefore, that which ought to surprise us is not that these duplicates exist here and there upon the earth, but that they are to be met with in the same place and appear together before our eyes, little accustomed to see such resemblances. From Amphitryon down to our own days, many fables have owed their origin to this fact, and history also has provided a few examples, such as the false Demetrius in Russia, the English Perkin Warbeck, and several other celebrated impostors, whilst the story we now present to our readers is no less curious and strange. On the 10th of August, 1557, an inauspicious day in the history of France, the roar of cannons was still heard at 6 in the evening on the plains of St. Quentin, where the French army had just been destroyed by the united troops of England and Spain, commanded by the famous Captain Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, and utterly beaten infantry, the Constable Montmorency, and several generals taken prisoner, the Duke Lenghien mortally wounded, the flower of nobility cut down like grass. Such were the terrible results of a battle which plunged France into mourning, and which would have been a blot on the reign of Henry II, had not the Duke of Guise obtained a brilliant revenge the following year. In a little village less than a mile from the field of battle were to be heard the groans of the wounded and dying, who had been carried thither from the field of battle. The inhabitants had given up their houses to be used as hospitals, and 2 or 3 barber surgeons went hither and thither, hastily ordering operations which they left to their assistants, and driving out fugitives who had contrived to accompany the wounded under pretence of assisting friends or near relations. They had already expelled a good number of these poor fellows when, opening the door of a small room, they found a soldier soaked in blood, lying on a rough mat, and another soldier apparently attending on him with the utmost care. "Who are you?" said one of the surgeons to the sufferer. "I don't think you belong to our French troops." "Help!" cried the soldier. "Only help me!" and may God bless you for it." "From the color of that tunic," remarked the other surgeon, "I should wager the rascal belongs to some Spanish gentleman. By what blunder was he brought here?" "For pity's sake," murmured the poor fellow, "I am in such pain." "Die, wretch," responded the last speaker, pushing him with his foot. "Die like the dog you are." But this brutality, answered as it was by an agonized groan, disgusted the other surgeon. "After all, he is a man, and a wounded man who implores help. Leave him to me, Rene." Rene went out grumbling, and the one who remained proceeded to examine the wound. A terrible arquebus shot had passed through the leg, shattering the bone. Amputation was absolutely necessary. Before proceeding to the operation, the surgeon turned to the other soldier, who had retired into the darkest corner of the room. "And you, who may you be?" he asked. The man replied by coming forward into the light. No other answer was needed. He resembled his companion so closely that no one could doubt they were brothers, twin brothers probably. Both were above middle height. Both had olive-brown complexions, black eyes, hooked noses, pointed chins, a slightly projecting lower lip. Both were round-shouldered, though this defect did not amount to disfigurement. The whole personality suggested strength, and was not destitute of masculine beauty. So strong a likeness is hardly ever seen. Even their ages appeared to agree, for one would not have supposed either to be more than 32, and the only difference noticeable, besides the pale countenance of the wounded man, was that he was thin as compared with the moderate fleshiness of the other, also that he had a large scar over the right eyebrow. "Look well after your brother's soul," said the surgeon to the soldier, who remained standing. "If it is in no better case than his body, it is much to be pitied." "Is there no hope?" inquired the Sogia of the wounded man. "The wound is too large and too deep," replied the man of science, "to be cauterized with boiling oil according to the ancient method. Delenda est causa mali, the source of the evil must be destroyed, as says the learned Ambrose Parr. I ought therefore secrofero, that is to say, take off the leg. May God grant that he survive the operation." While seeking his instruments, he looked the supposed brother full in the face, and added, "But how is it that you are carrying muskets and opposing armies? For I see that you belong to us, for this poor fellow wears Spanish uniform." "Oh, that would be a long story to tell," replied the soldier, shaking his head. "As for me, I followed the career which was open to me, and took service of my own free will under the banner of our Lord King Henry II. This man, whom you rightly suppose to be my brother, was born in Biscay, and became attached to the household of the Cardinal of Burgos, and afterwards to the Cardinal's brother, whom he was obliged to follow to the war. I recognized him on the battlefield just as he fell. I dragged him out of a heap of dead, and brought him here." During his recital, this individual's features betrayed considerable agitation, but the surgeon did not heed it. Not finding some necessary instruments, "My colleague," he exclaimed, "must have carried them off. He constantly does this out of jealousy of my reputation, but I will be even with him yet. Such splendid instruments, they will almost work of themselves, and are capable of imparting some skill even to him, dunce as he is. I shall be back in an hour or two. He must rest, sleep, have nothing to excite him, nothing to inflame the wound, and when the operation is well over, we shall see. May the Lord be gracious to him." Then he went to the door, leaving the poor wretch in the care of his supposed brother. "My God," he added, shaking his head, "if he survive, it will be by the help of a miracle." Scarcely had he left the room when the unwounded soldier carefully examined the features of the wounded one. "Yes," he murmured between his teeth, "they were right in saying that my exact double was to be found in the hostile army. Truly one would not know us apart. I might be surveying myself in a mirror. I did well to look for him in the rear of the Spanish army, and thanks to the fellow who rolled him over so conveniently with that arquebus shot, I was able to escape the dangers of the melee by carrying him out of it. But that's not all," he thought. still carefully studying the tortured face of the unhappy sufferer. "It is not enough to have got out of that. I have absolutely nothing in the world, no home, no resources. Beggar by birth, adventurer by fortune, I have enlisted and have consumed my pay. I hoped for plunder, and here we are in full flight. What am I to do? Go and drown myself? No, certainly a cannonball would be as good as that. But can't I profit by this chance and obtain a decent position by turning to my own advantage this curious resemblance, and making some use of this man whom fate has thrown in my way, and who has but a short time to live?" Arguing thus, he bent over the prostrate man with a cynical laugh. One might have thought he was Satan, watching the departure of a soul too utterly lost to escape him. "Alas, alas," cried the sufferer, "may God have mercy on me. I feel my end is near." "Bah, comrade, drive away these dismal thoughts. Your leg pains they will cut it off. Think only of the other one, and trust in Providence." "Water, a drop of water, for heaven's sake." The sufferer was in a high fever. The would-be nurse looked around and saw a jug of water, towards which the dying man extended a trembling hand. A truly infernal idea entered his mind. He poured some water into a gourd which hung from his belt, held it to the lips of the wounded man, and then withdrew it. "Oh, I thirst! That water! For pity's sake, give me some." "Yes, but on one condition. You must tell me your whole history." "Yes, but give me water." His tormentor allowed him to swallow a mouthful, then overwhelmed him with questions as to his family, his friends, and fortune, and compelled him to answer by keeping before his eyes the water which could relieve the fever which devoured him. After this often interrupted interrogation, the sufferer sank back exhausted and almost insensible. But, not yet satisfied, his companion conceived the idea of reviving him with a few drops of brandy, which quickly brought back the fever, and excited his brain sufficiently to enable him to answer fresh questions. The doses of spirit were doubled several times, at the risk of ending the unhappy man's days then and there. Almost delirious, his head feeling as if on fire, his sufferings gave way to a feverish excitement which took him back to other places and other times. He began to recall the days of his youth and the country where he lived, but his tongue was still fettered by a kind of reserve. His secret thoughts, the private details of his past life, were not yet told, and it seemed as though he might die at any moment. Time was passing, night already coming on, and it occurred to the merciless questioner to profit by the gathering darkness. By a few solemn words he aroused the religious feelings of the sufferer, terrified him by speaking of the punishments of another life and flames of hell, until to the delirious fancy of the sick man he took the form of a judge who could either deliver him to eternal damnation or open the gates of heaven to him. At length, overwhelmed by a voice which resounded in his ear like that of a minister of God, the dying man laid bare his inmost soul before his tormentor, and made his last confession to him. Yet a few moments, and the executioner, he deserves no other name, hangs over his victim, opens his tunic, seizes some papers and a few coins, half draws his dagger, but thinks better of it, then contemptuously spurning the victim as the other surgeon had done. "I might kill you," he says, "but it would be a useless murder. It would only be hastening your last sigh by an hour or two, and advancing my claims to your inheritance by the same space of time." And he adds mockingly, "Farewell, my brother." The wounded soldier utters a feeble groan. The adventurer leaves the room. 4 months later, a woman sat at the door of a house at one end of the village of Artigues, near Rieux, and played with a child about 9 or 10 years of age. Still young, she had the brown complexion of southern women, and her beautiful black hair fell in curls about her face. Her flashing eyes occasionally betrayed hidden passions, concealed, however, beneath an apparent indifference and lassitude, and her wasted form seemed to acknowledge the existence of some secret grief. An observer would have divined a shattered life, a withered happiness, a soul grievously wounded. Her dress was that of a wealthy peasant, and she wore one of the long gowns with hanging sleeves which were in fashion in the 16th century. The house in front of which she sat belonged to her, so also the immense field which adjoined the garden. Her attention was divided between the play of her son and the orders she was giving to an old servant, when an exclamation from the child startled her. "Mother!" he cried. "Mother, there he is!" She looked where the child pointed, and saw a young boy turning the corner of the street. "Yes," continued the child, "that is the lad who, when I was playing with the other boys yesterday, called me all sorts of bad names." "What sort of names, my child?" "There was one I did not understand, but it must have been a very bad one, for the other boys all pointed at me and left me alone. He called me, and he said it was only what his mother had told him. He called me a wicked bastard." His mother's face became purple with indignation. "What?" she cried. "They dared! What an insult!" "What does this bad word mean, mother?" asked the child, half frightened by her anger. "Is that what they call poor children who have no father?" His mother folded him in her arms. "Oh," she continued, "it is an infamous slander. These people never saw your father. They have only been here 6 months, and this is the 8th since he went away. But this is abominable. We were married in that church. We came at once to live in this house, which was my marriage portion, and my poor Martin has relations and friends here who will not allow his wife to be insulted." "Say rather his widow," interrupted a solemn voice. "Ah, uncle," exclaimed the woman, turning towards an old man who had just emerged from the house. "Yes, Bertrand," continued the newcomer, "you must get reconciled to the idea that my nephew has ceased to exist. I am sure he was not such a fool as to have remained all this time without letting us hear from him. He was not the fellow to go off at a tangent on account of a domestic quarrel which you have never vouchsafed to explain to me, and to retain his anger during all these 8 years. Where did he go? What did he do? We none of us know, neither you nor I, nor anybody else. He is assuredly dead, and lies in some graveyard far enough from here. May God have mercy on his soul." Bertrand, weeping, made the sign of the cross, and bowed her head upon her hands. "Goodbye, Sanxi," said the uncle, tapping the child's cheek. Sanxi turned sulkily away. There was certainly nothing specially attractive about the uncle. He belonged to a type which children instinctively dislike, false, crafty, with squinting eyes which continually appeared to contradict his honeyed tongue. "Bertrand," he said, "your boy is like his father before him, and only answers my kindness with rudeness." "Forgive him," answered the mother. "He is very young, and does not understand the respect due his father's uncle. I will teach him better things. He will soon learn that he ought to be grateful for the care you have taken of his little property." No doubt," said the uncle, trying hard to smile. "I will give you a good account of it, for I shall only have to reckon with you two in the future. Come, my dear, believe me, your husband is really dead, and you have sorrowed quite enough for a good-for-nothing fellow. Think no more of him." So saying, he departed, leaving the poor young woman a prey to the saddest thoughts. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Chapter 2, Part 2 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2 by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2 by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 2, Part 2. Bertrand de Rolls, naturally gifted with extreme sensibility, on which a careful education had imposed due restraint, had barely completed her 12th year when she was married to Martin Guerre, a boy of about the same age, such precocious unions being then not uncommon, especially in the southern provinces. They were generally settled by considerations of family interest, assisted by the extremely early development habitual to the climate. The young couple lived for a long time as brother and sister, and Bertrand, thus early familiar with the idea of domestic happiness, bestowed her whole affection on the youth whom she had been taught to regard as her life's companion. He was the alpha and omega of her existence. All her love, all her thoughts were given to him, and when their marriage was at length completed, the birth of a son seemed only another link in the already long existing bond of union. But, as many wise men have remarked, a uniform happiness, which only attaches women more and more, has often upon men a precisely contrary effect. And so it was with Martin Guerre. Of a lively and excitable temperament, he wearied of a yoke which had been imposed so early, and anxious to see the world and enjoy some freedom, he one day took advantage of a domestic difference, in which Bertrande owned herself to have been wrong, and left his house and family. He was sought and awaited in vain. Bertrande spent the first month in vainly expecting his return, then she betook herself to prayer. But heaven appeared deaf to her supplications. The truant returned not. She wished to go in search of him, but the world is wide, and no single trace remained to guide her. What torture for a tender heart! What suffering for a soul thirsting for love! What sleepless nights! What restless vigils! Years passed thus. Her son was growing up, yet not a word reached her from the man she loved so much. She spoke often of him to the uncomprehending child. She sought to discover his features in those of her boy. But though she endeavored to concentrate her whole affection on her son, she realized that there is suffering which maternal love cannot console, and tears which it cannot dry. Consumed by the strength of the sorrow which ever dwelt in her heart, the poor woman was slowly wasting, worn out by the regrets of the past, the vain desires of the present, and the dreary prospect of the future. And now she had been openly insulted, her feelings as a mother wounded to the quick, and her husband's uncle, instead of defending and consoling her, could give only cold counsel and unsympathetic words. Pierre Guerre, indeed, was simply a thorough egotist. In his youth he had been charged with usury. No one knew by what means he had become rich, for the little drapery trade which he called his profession did not appear to be very profitable. After his nephew's departure, it seemed only natural that he should pose as the family guardian, and he applied himself to the task of increasing the little income, but without considering himself bound to give any account to Bertrande. So once persuaded that Martin was no more, he was apparently not unwilling to prolong a situation so much to his own advantage. Night was fast coming on. In the dim twilight, distant objects became confused and indistinct. It was the end of autumn, that melancholy season which suggests so many gloomy thoughts and recalls so many blighted hopes. The child had gone into the house. Bertrande, still sitting at the door, resting her forehead on her hand, thought sadly of her uncle's words, recalling in imagination the past scenes which they suggested, the time of their childhood, when, married so young, they were as yet only playmates, prefacing the graver duties of life by innocent pleasures. Then of the love which grew with their increasing age. Then of how this love became altered, changing on her side into passion, on his into indifference. She tried to recollect him as he had been on the eve of his departure, young and handsome, carrying his head high, coming home from a fatiguing hunt and sitting by his son's cradle. And then also she remembered bitterly the jealous suspicions she had conceived, the anger with which she had allowed them to escape her, the consequent quarrel, followed by the disappearance of her offended husband, and the 8 succeeding years of solitude and mourning. She wept over his desertion, over the desolation of her life, seeing around her only indifferent or selfish people, and caring only to live for her child's sake, who gave her at least a shadowy reflection of the husband she had lost. Lost, yes, lost forever, she said to herself, sighing, and looking again at the fields where she had so often seen him coming at this same twilight hour, returning to his home for the evening meal. She cast a wandering eye on the distant hills which showed a black outline against a yet fiery western sky, then let it fall on a little grove of olive trees planted on the farther side of the brook which skirted her dwelling. Everything was calm. Approaching night brought silence along with darkness. It was exactly what she saw every evening, but to leave which required always an effort. She rose to re-enter the house, when her attention was caught by a movement amongst the trees. For a moment she thought she was mistaken, but the branches again rustled, then parted asunder, and the form of a man appeared on the other side of the brook. Terrified, Bertrand tried to scream, but not a sound escaped her lips. Her voice seemed paralyzed by terror, as in an evil dream, and she almost thought it was a dream, for notwithstanding the dark shadows cast around this indistinct semblance, she seemed to recognize features once dear to her. Had her bitter reveries ended by making her the victim of a hallucination? She thought her brain was giving way, and sank on her knees to pray for help. But the figure remained. It stood motionless, with folded arms, silently gazing at her. Then she thought of witchcraft, of evil demons, and superstitious as every one was in those days, she kissed a crucifix which hung from her neck, and fell fainting on the ground. With one spring the phantom crossed the brook and stood beside her. "Bertrand," it said in a voice of emotion. She raised her head, uttered a piercing cry, and was clasped in her husband's arms. The whole village became aware of this event that same evening. The neighbors crowded around Bertrand's door, Martin's friends and relations naturally wishing to see him after this miraculous reappearance, while those who had never known him desired no less to gratify their curiosity, so that the hero of the little drama, instead of remaining quietly at home with his wife, was obliged to exhibit himself publicly in a neighboring barn. His 4 sisters burst through the crowd and fell on his neck weeping. His uncle examined him doubtfully at first, then extended his arms. Everybody recognized him, beginning with the old servant Marguerite, who had been with the young couple ever since their wedding day. People observed only that a riper age had strengthened his features, and given more character to his countenance and more development to his powerful figure. Also that he had a scar over the right eyebrow, and that he limped slightly. These were the marks of wounds he had received, he said, which now no longer troubled him. He appeared anxious to return to his wife and child, but the crowd insisted on hearing the story of his adventures during his voluntary absence, and he was obliged to satisfy them. 8 years ago, he said, the desire to see more of the world had gained an irresistible mastery over him. He yielded to it, and departed secretly. A natural longing took him to his birthplace in Biscay, where he had seen his surviving relatives. There he met the Cardinal of Burgos, who took him into his service, promising him profit, hard knocks to give and take, and plenty of adventure. Some time after, he left the Cardinal's household for that of his brother, who much against his will compelled him to follow him to the war and bear arms against the French. Thus he found himself on the Spanish side on the day of St. Quentin, and received a terrible gunshot wound in the leg. Being carried into a house at an adjoining village, he fell into the hands of a surgeon, who insisted that the leg must be amputated immediately, but who left him for a moment, and never returned. Then he encountered a good old woman who dressed his wound and nursed him night and day, so that in a few weeks he recovered, and he was able to set out for Artigues, too thankful to return to his house and land, still more to his wife and child, and fully resolved never to leave them again. Having ended his story, he shook hands with his still wondering neighbors, addressing by name some who had been very young when he left, and who, hearing their names, came forward now as grown men, hardly recognizable, but much pleased at being remembered. He returned his sister's caresses, begged his uncle's forgiveness for the trouble he had given in his boyhood, recalling with mirth the various corrections received. He mentioned also an Augustinian monk who had taught him to read, and another reverend father, a Capuchin, whose irregular conduct had caused much scandal in the neighborhood. In short, notwithstanding his prolonged absence, he seemed to have a perfect recollection of places, persons, and things. The good people overwhelmed him with congratulations, vying with one another in praising him for having the good sense to come home, and in describing the grief and the perfect virtue of his Bertrand. Emotion was excited, many wept, and several bottles from Martin Guerre's cellar were emptied. At length the assembly dispersed, uttering many exclamations about the extraordinary chances of fate, and retired to their own homes, excited, astonished, and gratified, with the one exception of old Pierre Guerre, who had been struck by an unsatisfactory remark made by his nephew, and who dreamed all night about the chances of pecuniary loss augured by the latter's return. It was midnight before the husband and wife were alone and able to give vent to their feelings. Bertrand still felt half stupefied. She could not believe her own eyes and ears, nor realize that she saw again in her marriage chamber her husband of 8 years ago, him for whom she had wept, whose death she had deplored only a few hours previously. In the sudden shock caused by so much joy succeeding so much grief, she had not been able to express what she felt. Her confused ideas were difficult to explain, and she seemed deprived of the powers of speech and reflection. When she became calmer and more capable of analyzing her feelings, she was astonished not to feel towards her husband the same affection which had moved her so strongly a few hours before. It was certainly himself, those were the same features, that was the man to whom she had willingly given her hand, her heart, herself, and yet now that she saw him again, a cold barrier of shyness, of modesty, seemed to have arisen between them. His first kiss, even, had not made her happy. She blushed and felt saddened, a curious result of the long absence. She could not define the changes wrought by years in his appearance. His countenance seemed harsher, yet the lines of his face, his outer man, his whole personality, did not seem altered. But his soul had changed its nature. A different mind looked forth from those eyes. Bertrand knew him for her husband, and yet she hesitated. Even so, Penelope, on the return of Ulysses, required a certain proof to confirm the evidence of her eyes, and her long-absent husband had to remind her of secrets known only to herself. Martin, however, as if he understood Bertrand's feeling and divined some secret mistrust, used the most tender and affectionate phrases, and even the very pet names which close intimacy had formerly endeared to them. "My queen," he said, "my beautiful dove, can you not lay aside your resentment? Is it still so strong that no submission can soften it? Cannot my repentance find grace in your eyes? My Bertrand, my Bertha, my Bertranella, as I used to call you." She tried to smile, but stopped short, puzzled. The names were the very same, but the inflection of voice quite different. Martin took her hands in his. "What pretty hands! Do you still wear my ring?" "Yes, here it is, and with it the sapphire ring I gave you the day Sanxi was born." Bertrand did not answer, but she took the child and placed him in his father's arms. Martin showered caresses on his son, and spoke of the time when he carried him as a baby in the garden, lifting him up to the fruit tree so that he could reach and try to bite the fruit. He recollected one day when the poor child got his leg terribly torn by thorns, and convinced himself, not without emotion, that the scar could still be seen. Bertrand was touched by this display of affectionate recollections, and felt vexed at her own coldness. She came up to Martin and laid her hand in his. He said gently, "My departure caused you great grief. I now repent what I did. But I was young, I was proud, and your reproaches were unjust." "Ah," said she, "you have not forgotten the cause of our quarrel? It was little Rose, our neighbor, whom you said I was making love to, because you found us together at the spring in the little wood. I explained that we met only by chance. Besides, she was only a child, but you would not listen, and in your anger— forgive me, Martin, forgive me," she interrupted in confusion. "In your blind anger you took up, I know not what, something which lay handy, and flung it at me. And here is the mark," he continued, smiling, "this scar, which is still to be seen." "Oh, Martin," Bertrand exclaimed, "can you ever forgive me?" "As you see," Martin replied, kissing her tenderly. Much moved, Bertrand swept aside his hair and looked at the scar visible on his forehead. "But," she said, with surprise not free from alarm, "this scar seems to me like a fresh one." "Ah," Martin exclaimed with a little embarrassment, "it reopened lately, but I had thought no more about it." "Let us forget it, Bertrand. I should not like a recollection which might make you think yourself less dear to me than you once were," and he drew her upon his knee. She repelled him gently. "Send the child to bed," said Martin. "Tomorrow shall be for him. Tonight you have the first place, Bertrand, you only." The boy kissed his father and went. Bertrand came and knelt beside her husband, regarding him attentively with an uneasy smile, which did not appear to please him by any means. "What is the matter?" said he. "Why do you examine me thus?" "I do not know. Forgive me. Oh, forgive me. But the happiness of seeing you is so great and unexpected, it is all like a dream. I must try to become accustomed to it. Give me some time to collect myself. Let me spend this night in prayer. I ought to offer my joy and my thanksgiving to Almighty God." "Not so," interrupted her husband, passing his arms around her neck and stroking her beautiful hair. "No, 'tis to me that your first thoughts are due. After so much weariness, my rest is in again beholding you, and my happiness after so many trials will be found in your love. That hope has supported me throughout, and I long to be assured that it is no illusion." So saying, he endeavored to raise her. "Oh," she murmured, "I pray you leave me." "What?" he exclaimed angrily. "Bertrand, is this your love? Is it thus you keep faith with me? You will make me doubt the evidence of your friends. You will make me think that indifference, or even another love—" "You insult me," said Bertrand, rising to her feet. He caught her in his arms. "No, no, I think nothing which could wound you, my queen, and I believe your fidelity, even as before, you know, on that first journey when you wrote me these loving letters which I have treasured ever since. Here they are," and he drew forth some papers on which Bertrand recognized her own handwriting. "Yes," he continued, "I have read and reread them. See, you spoke then of your love and the sorrows of absence. But why all this trouble and terror? You tremble just as you did when I first received you from your father's hands. It was here, in this very room. You begged me then to leave you, to let you spend the night in prayer, but I insisted, do you remember, and pressed you to my heart as I do now." "Oh," she murmured weakly, "have pity." But the words were intercepted by a kiss, and the remembrance of the past, the happiness of the present, resumed their sway. The imaginary terrors were forgotten, and the curtains closed around the marriage bed. The next day was a festival in the village of Artigues. Martin returned the visits of all who had come to welcome him the previous night, and there were endless recognitions and embracings. The young men remembered that he had played with them when they were little, the old men that they had been at his wedding when he was only 12. The women remembered having envied Bertrand, especially the pretty Rose, daughter of Marcel, the apothecary, she who had roused the demon of jealousy in the poor wife's heart. And Rose knew quite well that the jealousy was not without some cause, for Martin had indeed shown her attention, and she was unable to see him again without emotion. She was now the wife of a rich peasant, ugly, old, and jealous, and she compared, sighing, her unhappy lot with that of her more fortunate neighbor. Martin's sisters detained him amongst them, and spoke of their childish games and of their parents, both dead in Biscay. Martin dried the tears which flowed at all these recollections of the past, and turned their thoughts to rejoicing. Banquets were given and received. Martin invited all his relations and former friends, and easy gaiety prevailed. It was remarked that the hero of the feast refrained from wine. He was thereupon reproached, but answered that on account of the wounds he had received he was obliged to avoid excess. The excuse was admitted, the result of Martin's precautions being that he kept a clear head on his shoulders, while all the rest had their tongues loosed by drunkenness. "Ah," exclaimed one of the guests who had studied a little medicine, Martin is quite right to be afraid of drink. Wounds which have thoroughly healed may be reopened and inflamed by intemperance, and wine, in the case of recent wounds, is deadly poison. Men have died on the field of battle in an hour or two merely because they had swallowed a little brandy. Martin Guerre grew pale and began a conversation with the pretty Rose, his neighbor. Bertrand observed this, but without uneasiness. She had suffered too much from her former suspicions. Besides, her husband showed her so much affection that she was now quite happy. When the first few days were over, Martin began to look into his affairs. His property had suffered by his long absence, and he was obliged to go to Biscay to claim his little estate there, the law having already laid hands upon it. It was several months before, by dint of making judicious sacrifices, he could regain possession of the house and fields which had belonged to his father. This at last accomplished, he returned to Artigues, in order to resume the management of his wife's property, and with this end in view, about 11 months after his return, he paid a visit to his uncle Pierre. Pierre was expecting him. He was extremely polite, desired Martin to sit down, overwhelmed him with compliments, knitting his brows as he discovered that his nephew decidedly meant business. Martin broke silence. "Uncle," he said, "I come to thank you for the care you have taken of my wife's property. She could never have managed it alone. You have received the income in the family interest. As a good guardian, I expected no less from your affection. But now that I have returned and am free from other cares, we will go over the accounts, if you please." His uncle coughed and cleared his voice before replying, then said slowly, as if counting his words, "It is all accounted for, my dear nephew. Heaven be praised. I don't owe you anything." "What?" exclaimed the astonished Martin. "But the whole income was well and properly employed in the maintenance of your wife and child." "What? 1,000 livres for that? And Bertrand lived alone, so quietly and simply. Nonsense! It is impossible." "Any surplus," resumed the old man, quite unmoved, "any surplus went to pay the expenses of seed time and harvest." "What? At a time when labor costs next to nothing?" "Here is the account," said Pierre. "Then the account is a false one," returned his nephew. Pierre thought it advisable to appear extremely offended and angry, and Martin, exasperated at his evident dishonesty, took still higher ground, and threatened to bring an action against him. Pierre ordered him to leave the house, and suiting actions to words, took hold of his arm to enforce his departure. Martin, furious, turned and raised his fist to strike. "What? Strike your uncle, wretched boy?" exclaimed the old man. Martin's hand dropped, but he left the house uttering reproaches and insults, among which Pierre distinguished, "Cheat that you are." "That is a word I shall remember," cried the angry old man, slamming his door violently. End of Chapter 2, Part 2.
Chapter 2, Part 3 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Blaine Jushaw, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 2, Part 3. Martin brought an action before the judge at Rieux, and in course of time obtained a decree, which, reviewing the accounts presented by Pierre, disallowed them, and condemned the dishonest guardian to pay his nephew 400 livres for each year of his administration. The day on which this sum had to be dispersed from his strong-box, the old usurer vowed vengeance, but until he could gratify his hatred he was forced to conceal it, and to receive attempts at reconciliation with a friendly smile. It was not until 6 months later, on the occasion of a joyous festivity, that Martin again set foot in his uncle's house. The bells were ringing for the birth of a child. There was great gaiety at Bertrand's house, where all the guests were waiting on the threshold for the godfather in order to take the infant to church, and when Martin appeared, escorting his uncle, who was adorned with a huge bouquet for the occasion, and who now came forward and took the hand of Rose, the pretty godmother, there were cries of joy on all sides. Bertrand was delighted at this reconciliation, and dreamed only of happiness. She was so happy now, her long sorrow was atoned for, her regret was at an end. Her prayers seemed to have been heard, the long interval between the former delights and the present seemed wiped out, as if the bond of union had never been broken, and if she remembered her grief at all, it was only to intensify the new joys by comparison. She loved her husband more than ever. He was full of affection for her, and she was grateful for his love. The past had now no shadow, the future no cloud, and the birth of a daughter, drawing still closer the links which united them, seemed a new pledge of felicity. Alas, the horizon which appeared so bright and clear to the poor woman was doomed soon again to be overcast. The very evening of the christening party, a band of musicians and jugglers happened to pass through the village, and the inhabitants showed themselves liberal. Pierre asked questions, and found that the leader of the band was a Spaniard. He invited the man to his own house, and remained closeted with him for nearly an hour, dismissing him at length with a refilled purse. 2 days later the old man announced to the family that he was going to Picardy to see a former partner on a matter of business, and he departed accordingly, saying he should return before long. The day on which Bertrand again saw her uncle was, indeed, a terrible one. She was sitting by the cradle of the lately born infant, watching for its awakening, when the door opened and Guerre strode in. Bertrand drew back with an instinct of terror as soon as she saw him, for his expression was at once wicked and joyful, an expression of gratified hate, of mingled rage and triumph, and his smile was terrible to behold. She did not venture to speak, but motioned him to a seat. He came straight up to her, and raised his head, and said loudly, "Kneel down at once, madam, kneel down, and ask pardon from Almighty God." "Are you mad, Pierre?" she replied, gazing at him in astonishment. "You, at least, ought to know that I am not." "Pray for forgiveness. And what for, in heaven's name?" "For the crime in which you are an accomplice." "Please explain yourself." "Oh," said Pierre, with bitter irony, "a woman always thinks herself innocent as long as her sin is hidden. She thinks the truth will never be known, and her conscience goes quietly to sleep, forgetting her faults. Here is a woman who thought her sins nicely concealed. Chance favoured her, an absent husband, probably no more, another man so exactly like him in height, face, and manner that everyone else is deceived. Is it strange that a weak, sensitive woman, wearied of widowhood, should willingly allow herself to be imposed upon?" Bertrand listened without understanding. She tried to interrupt, but Pierre went on. "It was easy to accept this stranger without having to blush for it, easy to give him the name and the rights of a husband. She could even appear faithful, while really guilty. She could seem constant, though really fickle, and she could, under a veil of mystery, at once reconcile her honour, her duty, perhaps even her love." "What on earth do you mean?" cried Bertrand, wringing her hands in terror. "That you are countenancing an impostor who is not your husband." Feeling as if the ground were passing from beneath her, Bertrand staggered and caught at the nearest piece of furniture to save herself from falling. Then, collecting all her strength to meet this extraordinary attack, she faced the old man. "What? My husband? Your nephew? An impostor?" "Don't you know it?" "Aye." This cry, which came from her heart, convinced Pierre that she did not know, and that she had sustained a terrible shock. He continued more quietly. "What? Bertrand, is it possible you were really deceived?" "Pierre, you are killing me. Your words are torture. No more mystery, I entreat. What do you know? What do you suspect? Tell me plainly at once." "Have you the courage to hear it?" "I must," said the trembling woman. "God is my witness that I would willingly have kept it from you, but you must know, if only for the safety of your soul entangled in so deadly a snare. There is yet time, if you follow my advice. Listen, the man with whom you are living, who dares to call himself Martin Guerre, is a cheat, an impostor." "How dare you say so?" "Because I have discovered it. Yes, I had always a vague suspicion, an uneasy feeling, and in spite of the marvellous resemblance, I could never feel as if you were really my sister's child. The day he raised his hand to strike me, yes, that day I condemned him utterly. Chance has defied me. A wandering Spaniard, an old soldier, who spent a night in the village here, was also present at the Battle of San Quentin, and saw Martin Guerre receive a terrible gunshot wound in the leg. After the battle, being wounded, he betook himself to the neighbouring village, and distinctly heard a surgeon in the next room say that a wounded man must have his leg amputated, and would very likely not survive the operation. The door opened, he saw the sufferer, and knew him for Martin Guerre. So much the Spaniard told me. Acting on this information, I went on pretence of business to the village he named. I questioned the inhabitants, and this is what I learned." "Well?" said Bertrand, pale and gasping with emotion. "I learned that the wounded man had his leg taken off, and, as the surgeon predicted, he must have died in a few hours, for he was never seen again." Bertrand remained a few moments as if annihilated by this appalling revelation. Then, endeavouring to repel the horrible thought, "No," she cried, "no, it is impossible. It's a lie intended to ruin him, to ruin us all." "What? You do not believe me?" "No, never, never." "Say rather you pretend to disbelieve me. The truth has pierced your heart, but you wish to deny it. Think, however, of the dangers to your immortal soul." "Silence, wretched man! No, God would not send me so terrible a trial. What proof can you show of the truth of your words?" "The witnesses I have mentioned." "Nothing more?" "No, not as yet." "Fine proofs indeed. The story of a vagabond who flattered your hatred in hope of a reward, the gossip of a distant village, the recollections of 10 years back, and finally your own word, the word of a man who seeks only revenge, the word of a man who swore to make Martin pay dearly for the results of his own avarice, a man of furious passions such as yours. No, Pierre, no, I do not believe you, and I never will." "Other people may perhaps be less incredulous, and if I accuse him publicly—" "Then I shall contradict you publicly." And coming quickly forward, her eyes shining with virtuous anger, "Leave this house. Go," she said. "It is you yourself who are the impostor. Go." "I shall yet know how to convince everyone, and will make you acknowledge it," cried the furious old man. He went out, and Bertrand sank exhausted into a chair. All the strength which had supported her against Pierre vanished as soon as she was alone, and in spite of her resistance to suspicion, the terrible light of doubt penetrated her heart, and extinguished the pure torch of trustfulness which had guided her hitherto. A doubt, alas, which attacked at once her honour and her love, for she loved with all a woman's tender affection. Just as actual poison gradually penetrates and circulates through the whole system, corrupting the blood and affecting the very sources of life, until it causes the destruction of the whole body, so does that mental poison, suspicion, extend its ravages in the soul which has received it. Bertrande remembered with terror her first feelings at the sight of the return of Martin Guerre, her involuntary repugnance, her astonishment at not feeling more in touch with the husband whom she had so sincerely regretted. She remembered also, as if she saw it for the first time, that Martin, formerly quick, lively, and hasty-tempered, now seemed thoughtful and fully master of himself. This change of character she had supposed due to the natural development of age. She now trembled at the idea of another possible cause. Some other little details began to occur to her mind, the forgetfulness or abstraction of her husband as to a few insignificant things. Thus it sometimes happened that he did not answer to his name of Martin. Also that he mistook the road to a hermitage formerly well known to them both, and again that he could not answer when addressed in Basque, although he himself had taught her the little she knew of this language. Besides, since his return, he would never write in her presence. Did he fear that she would notice some difference? She had paid little or no attention to these trifles. Now, pieced together, they assumed an alarming importance. An appalling terror seized Bertrande. Was she to remain in this uncertainty? Or should she seek an explanation which might prove her destruction? And how discover the truth? By questioning the guilty man? By noting his confusion? His change of colour? By forcing a confession from him? But she had lived with him for 2 years. He was the father of her child. She could not ruin him without ruining herself. And, an explanation once sought, she could neither punish him and escape disgrace, nor pardon him without sharing his guilt. To reproach him with his conduct and then keep silence would destroy her peace forever. To cause a scandal by denouncing him would bring dishonour upon herself and her child. Night found her involved in these hideous perplexities, too weak to surmount them. An icy chill came over her. She went to bed, and awoke in a high fever. For several days she hovered between life and death, and Martin Guerre bestowed the most tender care upon her. She was greatly moved thereby, having one of those impressionable minds which recognize kindness fully as much as injury. When she was a little recovered and her mental power began to return, she had only a vague recollection of what had occurred, and thought she had had a frightful dream. She asked if Pierre Guerre had been to see her, and found he had not been near the house. This could only be explained by the scene which had taken place, and she then recollected all the accusation Pierre had made, her own observations which had confirmed it, all her grief and trouble. She inquired about the village news. Pierre, evidently, had kept silence. Why? Had he seen that his suspicions were unjust, or was he only seeking further evidence? She sank back into her cruel uncertainty, and resolved to watch Martin closely before deciding as to his guilt or innocence. How was she to suppose that God had created 2 faces so exactly alike, 2 beings precisely similar, and then sent them together into the world, and on the same track, merely to compass the ruin of an unhappy woman? A terrible idea took possession of her mind, an idea not uncommon in an age of superstition, namely, that the enemy himself could assume human form, and could borrow the semblance of a dead man in order to capture another soul for his infernal kingdom. Acting on this idea, she hastened to the church, paid for masses to be said, and prayed fervently. She expected every day to see the demon forsake the body he had animated, but her vows, offerings, and prayers had no result. But heaven sent her an idea which she wondered had not occurred to her before. "If the tempter," she said to herself, "has taken the form of my beloved husband, his power being supreme for evil, the resemblance would be exact, and no difference, however slight, would exist. If, however, it is only another man who resembles him, God must have made them with some slight distinguishing marks. She then remembered what she had not thought of before, having been quite unsuspicious before her uncle's accusations, and nearly out of her mind between mental and bodily suffering since. She remembered that on her husband's left shoulder, almost on the neck, there used to be one of those small, almost imperceptible, but ineffaceable birthmarks. Martin wore his hair very long. It was difficult to see if the mark were there or not. One night, while he slept, Bertrand cut away a lock of hair from the place where this sign ought to be. It was not there. Convinced at length of the deception, Bertrand suffered inexpressible anguish. This man whom she had loved and respected for 2 whole years, whom she had taken to her heart as a husband bitterly mourned for, this man was a cheat, an infamous impostor, and she, all unknowing, was yet a guilty woman. Her child was illegitimate, and the curse of heaven was due to this sacrilegious union. To complete the misfortune, she was already expecting another infant. She would have killed herself, but her religion and the love of her children forbade it. Kneeling before her child's cradle, she entreated pardon from the father of the one for the father of the other. She would not bring herself to proclaim aloud their infamy. "Oh," she said, "thou whom I loved, thou who art no more, thou knowest no guilty thought ever entered my mind. When I saw this man, I thought I beheld thee. When I was happy, I thought I owed it to thee. It was thee whom I loved in him. Surely thou dost not desire that by public avowal I should bring shame and disgrace on these children and on myself." She rose calm and strengthened. It seemed as if a heavenly inspiration had marked out her duty. To suffer in silence, such was the course she adopted, a life of sacrifice and self-denial, which she offered to God as an expiation for her involuntary sin. But who can understand the workings of the human heart? This man whom she ought to have loathed, this man who had made her an innocent partner in his crime, this unmasked impostor whom she should have beheld only with disgust, she loved him. The force of habit, the ascendancy he had obtained over her, the love he had shown her, 1,000 sympathies felt in her innermost heart, all these had so much influence that, instead of accusing and cursing him, she sought to excuse him on the plea of a passion to which, doubtless, he had yielded when usurping the name and place of another. She feared punishment for him yet more than disgrace for herself, and though resolved to no longer allow him the rights purchased by crime, she yet trembled at the idea of losing his love. It was this, above all, which decided her to keep eternal silence about her discovery. One single word which proved that his imposture was known would raise an insurmountable barrier between them. To conceal her trouble entirely was, however, beyond her power. Her eyes frequently showed traces of her secret tears. Martin several times asked the cause of her sorrow. She tried to smile and excuse herself, only immediately sinking back into her gloomy thoughts. Martin thought it mere caprice. He observed her loss of colour, her hollow cheeks, and concluded that age was impairing her beauty, and became less attentive to her. His absences became longer and more frequent, and he did not conceal his impatience and annoyance at being watched, for her looks hung upon his, and she observed his coldness and change with much grief. Having sacrificed all in order to retain his love, she now saw it slowly slipping away from her. Another person also observed attentively. Pierre Guerre, since his explanation with Bertrand, had apparently discovered no more evidence, and did not dare to bring an accusation without some positive proofs. Consequently, he lost no chance of watching the proceedings of his supposed nephew, silently hoping that chance might put him on the track of a discovery. He also concluded from Bertrand's state of melancholy that she had convinced herself of the fraud, but had resolved to conceal it. Martin was then endeavouring to sell part of his property, and this necessitated frequent interviews with the lawyers of the neighbouring town. Twice in the week he went to Rieux, and to make the journey easier he used to start horseback about 7 in the evening, sleep at Rieux, and return the following afternoon. This arrangement did not escape his enemy's notice, who was not long in convincing himself that part of the time ostensibly spent on this journey was otherwise employed. End of Chapter 2, Part 3. Chapter 2, Part 4 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Blaine Jushaw, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas, Chapter 2, Part 4. Towards 10 o'clock on the evening of a dark night, the door of a small house, lying about half a gunshot from the village, opened gently for the exit of a man wrapped in a large cloak, followed by a young woman, who accompanied him some distance. Arrived at the parting point, they separated with a tender kiss, and a few murmured words of adieu. The lover took his horse, which was fastened to a tree, mounted, and rode off towards Rieux. When the sounds died away, the woman turned slowly and sadly towards her home. But as she approached the door, a man suddenly turned the corner of the house and barred her away. Terrified, she was on the point of crying for help, when he seized her arm and ordered her to be silent. "Rose," he whispered, "I know everything. That man is your lover. In order to receive him safely, you send your old husband to sleep by means of a drug stolen from your father's shop. This intrigue has been going on for a month. Twice a week, at 7 o'clock, your door is open to this man, who does not proceed on his way to the town until 10. I know your lover. He is my nephew." Petrified with terror, Rose fell on her knees and implored mercy. "Yes," replied Pierre, "you may well be frightened. I have your secret. I have only to publish it, and you are ruined forever." "You will not do it," entreated the guilty woman, clasping her hands. "I have only to tell your husband," continued Pierre, "that his wife has dishonoured him, and to explain the reason of his unnaturally heavy sleep." "He will kill me." "No doubt. He is jealous. He is an Italian. He will know how to avenge himself, even as I do." "But I never did you any harm," Rose cried in despair. "Oh, have pity, have mercy, and spare me." "On one condition." "What is it?" "Come with me." Terrified almost out of her mind, Rose allowed him to lead her away. Bertrand had just finished her evening prayer, and was preparing for bed, when she was startled by several knocks at her door. Thinking that perhaps some neighbour was in need of help, she opened it immediately, and to her astonishment beheld a dishevelled woman, whom Pierre grasped by the arm. He exclaimed vehemently, "Here is thy judge. Now confess all to Bertrand." Bertrand did not at once recognize the woman, who fell at her feet, overcome by Pierre's threats. "Tell the truth here," he continued, "or I go and tell it to your husband, at your own home." "Ah, madam, kill me," said the unhappy creature, hiding her face. "Let me rather die by your hand than his." Bertrand, bewildered, did not understand the position in the least, but she recognized Rose. "But what is the matter, madam? Why are you here at this hour, pale and weeping? Why has my uncle dragged you hither? Am I to judge you, does he say? Of what crime are you guilty?" "Martin might answer that, if he were here," remarked Pierre. A lightning bolt flash of jealousy shot through Bertrand's soul at these words. All her former suspicions revived. "What?" she said. "My husband? What do you mean?" "That he left this woman's house only a little while ago, that for a month they have been meeting secretly. You are betrayed. I have seen them, and she does not dare deny it." "Have mercy!" cried Rose, still kneeling. The cry was a confession. Bertrand became pale as death. "Oh God!" she murmured. "Deceived, betrayed, and by him?" "For a month past," repeated the old man. "Oh, the wretch!" she continued with increasing passion. "Then his whole life is a lie. He has abused my credulity. He now abuses my love. He does not know me. He thinks he can trammel on me, in whose power are his fortune, his honor, his very life itself." Then turning to Rose, "And you, miserable woman, by what unworthy artifice did you gain his love? Was it by witchcraft, or some poisonous philtre, learned from your worthy father?" "Alas, no, madam. My weakness is my only crime, and also my only excuse. I loved him, long ago, when I was only a young girl, and these memories have been my ruin." "Memories? What? Did you also think you were loving the same man? Are you also his dupe? Or are you only pretending, in order to find a rag of excuse to cover your wickedness?" It was now Rose who failed to understand. Bertrand continued with growing excitement. "Yes, it was not enough to usurp the rights of a husband and father. He thought to play his part better still by deceiving the mistress also. Ah, it is amusing, is it not? You also, Rose. You thought he was your old lover. Well, I at least am excusable, I the wife, who only thought he was faithful to her husband." "What does it all mean?" asked the terrified Rose. "It means that this man is an impostor, that I will unmask him. Revenge, revenge." Pierre came forward. "Bertrand," he said, "so long as I thought you were happy, when I feared to disturb your peace, I was silent. I repressed my just indignation, and I spared the usurper of the name and rights of my nephew. Do you now give me leave to speak?" "Yes," she replied in a hollow voice. "You will not contradict me?" By way of answer she sat down by the table and wrote a few hasty lines with a trembling hand, then gave them to Pierre, whose eyes sparkled with joy. "Yes," he said, "vengeance for him. But for her, pity. Let this humiliation be her only punishment. I promised silence in return for confession. Will you grant it?" Bertrand assented with a contemptuous gesture. "Go, fear not," said the old man, and Rose went out. Pierre also left the house. Left to herself, Bertrand felt utterly worn out by so much emotion. Indignation gave way to depression. She began to realize what she had done, and the scandal which would fall on her own head. Just then her baby awoke, and held out his arms, smiling and calling for his father. Its father. Was he not a criminal? Yes. But was it for her to ruin him? To invoke the law? To send him to death? After having taken him to her heart, to deliver him to infamy, which would recoil on her own head and her child's, and on the infant which was yet unborn? If he had sinned before God, was it not for God to punish him? If against herself, ought she not rather to overwhelm him with contempt? But to invoke the help of strangers to expiate this offence, to lay bare the troubles of her life, to unveil the sanctuary of the nuptial couch. In short, to summon the whole world to behold this fatal scandal. Was not that what, in her imprudent anger, she had really done? She repented bitterly of her haste. She sought to avert the consequences, and notwithstanding the night and the bad weather, she hurried at once to Pierre's dwelling, hoping at all costs to withdraw her denunciation. He was not there. He had at once taken a horse and started for Rieux. Her accusation was already on its way to the magistrates. At break of day, the house where Martin Guerre lodged when at Rieux was surrounded by soldiers. He came forward with confidence and inquired what was wanted. On hearing the accusation, he changed colour slightly, then collected himself, and made no resistance. When he came before the judge, Bertrand's petition was read to him, declaring him to be an impostor who falsely and audaciously and treacherously had deceived her by taking the name and assuming the person of Martin Guerre, and demanding that he should be required to entreat pardon from God, the king, and herself. The prisoner listened calmly to the charge, and met it courageously, only evincing profound surprise at such a step being taken by his wife, who had lived with him for 2 years since his return, and who only now thought of disputing the rights he had so long enjoyed. As he was ignorant both of Bertrand's suspicions and their confirmation, and also of the jealousy which had inspired her accusation, his astonishment was perfectly natural, and did not at all appear to be assumed. He attributed the whole charge to the machinations of his uncle, Pierre Guerre, an old man, he said, who, being governed entirely by avarice and the desire of revenge, now disputed his name and rights, in order the better to deprive him of his property, which might be worth from 16 to 1800 livres. In order to attain this end, this wicked man had not hesitated to pervert his wife's mind, and, at the risk of her own dishonour, had instigated this calumnious charge, a horrible and unheard-of thing in the mouth of a lawful wife. "Ah, I do not blame her," he cried. "She must suffer more than I do, if she really entertains doubts such as these. But I deplore her readiness to listen to these extraordinary calumnies originated by my enemy." The judge was a good deal impressed by so much assurance. The accused was relegated to prison, whence he was brought 2 days later to encounter a formal examination. He began by explaining the cause of his long absence, originating, he said, in a domestic quarrel, as his wife well remembered. He there related his life during these 8 years. At first he wandered over the country, wherever his curiosity and the love of travel led him. Then he had crossed the frontier, revisited Biscay, where he was born, and having entered the service of the Cardinal of Burgos, he passed thence into the army of the King of Spain. He was wounded at the battle of San Quentin, conveyed to a neighbouring village, where he recovered, although threatened with amputation. Anxious to again behold his wife and child, his other relations, and the land of his adoption, he returned to Artigues, where he was immediately recognized by everyone, including the identical Pierre Guerre, his uncle, who now had the cruelty to disavow him. In fact, the latter had shown him special affection up to the day when Martin required an account of his stewardship. Had he only had the cowardice to sacrifice his money and thereby defraud his children, he would not today be charged as an impostor. But, continued Martin, I resisted, and a violent quarrel ensued, in which anger perhaps carried me too far. Pierre Guerre, cunning and revengeful, has waited in silence. He has taken his time and his measure to organize this plot, hoping thereby to obtain his ends, to bring justice to the help of his avarice, and to acquire the spoils he coveted, and revenge for his defeat by means of a sentence obtained from the scruples of the judges. Besides these explanations, which did not appear wanting in probability, Martin vehemently protested his innocence, demanding that his wife should be confronted with him, and declaring that in his presence she would not sustain the charge of personation brought against him, and that her mind, not being animated by the blind hatred which dominated his persecutor, the truth would undoubtedly prevail. He now, in his turn, demanded that the judge should acknowledge his innocence, and prove it by condemning his calumniators to the punishment invoked against himself, that his wife, Bertrand de Rolls, should be secluded in some house where her mind could no longer be perverted, and, finally, that his innocence should be declared, and expenses and compensations awarded him. After this speech, delivered with warmth and with every token of sincerity, he answered without difficulty all the interrogations of the judge. The following are some of the questions and answers, just as they have come down to us. In what part of Biscay were you born? In the village of Aimes, province of Guipuscoa. What were the names of your parents? Antonio Guerre and Marie Toriada. Are they still living? My father died June 15th, 1530. My mother survived him 3 years and 12 days. Have you any brothers and sisters? I had one brother, who lived only 3 months. My 4 sisters, Inez, Dorothea, Marietta, and Pedrina, all came to live at Artigues when I did. They are still here, and they all recognize me. What is the date of your marriage? January 10th, 1539. Who were present at the ceremony? My father-in-law, my mother-in-law, my uncle, my 2 sisters, Maitre Marcel, and his daughter, Rose, a neighbor called Claude Perrin, who got drunk at the wedding feast. Also Giraud, the poet, who composed verses in our honor. Who was the priest who married you? The old curé, Pascal Guerin, whom I did not find alive when I returned. What special circumstances occurred on the wedding day? At midnight exactly, our neighbor, Catherine Boer, brought us the repast, which is known as medianoche. This woman has recognized me, as also our old Marguerite, who has remained with us ever since the wedding. What is the date of your son's birth? February 10th, 1548, 9 years after our marriage. I was only 12 when the ceremony took place, and did not arrive at manhood until several years later. Give the date of your leaving Artigues. It was in August 1549. As I left the village, I met Claude Perrin and the curé Pascal, and took leave of them. I went towards Beauvais, and I passed through Orleans, Bourges, Limois, Bordeaux, and Toulouse. If you want the names of people whom I saw and to whom I spoke, you can have them. What more can I say? Never, indeed, was there a more apparently veracious statement. All the doings of Martin Guerre seemed to be most faithfully described, and surely only himself could thus narrate his own actions. As the historian remarks, alluding to the story of Amphitryon, Mercury himself could not better reproduce all Sosia's actions, gestures, and words than did the false Martin Guerre those of the real one. In accordance with the demand of the accused, Bertrand de Rolls was detained in seclusion in order to remove her from the influence of Pierre Guerre. The latter, however, did not waste time, and during the month spent in examining the witnesses cited by Martin, his diligent enemy, guided by some vague traces, departed on a journey from which he did not return alone. All the witnesses bore out the statement of the accused. The latter heard this in prison, and rejoiced, hoping for a speedy release. Before long he was again brought before the judge, who told him that his deposition had been confirmed by all the witnesses examined. "Do you know of no others?" continued the magistrate. "Have you no relatives except those you have mentioned?" "I have no others," answered the prisoner. "Then what do you say to this man?" said the judge, opening a door. An old man issued forth, who fell on the prisoner's neck, exclaiming, "My nephew!" Martin trembled in every limb, but only for a moment. Promptly recovering himself, and gazing calmly at the newcomer, he asked coolly, "And who may you be?" "What?" said the old man. "Do you not know me? Dare you deny me? Me, your mother's brother, Carbon Barreau, the old soldier, me who dandled you on my knee in your infancy, me who taught you later to carry a musket, me who met you during the war at an inn in Picardy when you fled secretly. Since then I have sought you everywhere. I've spoken of you and described your face and person, until a worthy inhabitant of this country offered to bring me hither, where indeed I did not expect to find my sister's son imprisoned and fettered as a malefactor. What is his crime? May it please your honour?" "You shall hear," replied the magistrate. "Then you identify the prisoner as your nephew. You affirm his name to be—" "Arnauld de Trille, also called Pansette, after his father, Jacques Pansette. His mother was Teresa Barreau, my sister, and he was born in the village of Sagias." "What do you have to say?" demanded the judge, turning to the accused. "Three things," replied the latter, unabashed. "This man is either mad, or he's been suborned to tell lies, or he's simply mistaken." The old man was struck dumb with astonishment, but his supposed nephew's start of terror had not been lost upon the judge, also much impressed by the straightforward frankness of Carbon Barreau. He caused fresh investigations to be made, and other inhabitants of Sagias were summoned to Rieux, who, one and all, agreed in identifying the accused as the same Arnauld de Trille, who had been born and had grown up under their very eyes. Several deposed that as he grew up he had taken to evil courses, and become an adept in thief and lying, not fearing even to take the sacred name of God in vain, in order to cover the untruth of his daring assertions. From such testimony the judge naturally concluded that Arnauld de Trille was quite capable of carrying on an imposture, and the impudence which he displayed was natural to his character. Moreover, he noted that the prisoner, who averred that he was born in Biscay, knew only a few words of the Basque language, and used these quite wrongly. He heard later another witness, who deposed that the original Martin Guerre was a good wrestler and skilled in the art of fence, whereas the prisoner, having wished to try what he could do, showed no skill whatever. Finally, a shoemaker was interrogated, and his evidence was not the least damning. Martin Guerre, he declared, required 12 holes to lace his boots, and his surprise had been great when he found those of the prisoner had only 9. Considering all these points and the cumulative evidence, the judge of Rieux set aside the favourable testimony, which he concluded had been the outcome of general credulity, imposed on by an extraordinary resemblance. He gave due weight also to Bertrand's accusation, although she had never confirmed it, and now maintained an obstinate silence, and he pronounced a judgment by which Arnauld de Trille was declared attainted and convicted of imposture, and was therefore condemned to be beheaded, after which his body should be divided into 4 quarters, and exposed at the 4 corners of the town. This sentence, as soon as it was known, caused much diversity of opinion in the town. The prisoner's enemies praised the wisdom of the judge, and those less prejudiced condemned his decision, as such conflicting testimony left room for doubt. Besides, it was thought that the possession of property and the future of the children required much consideration. Also that the most absolute certainty was demanded before annulling a past of 2 whole years, untroubled by any counterclaim whatsoever. End of Chapter 2, Part 4. Chapter 2, Part 5 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2 by Alexandre Dumas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Blaine Jushaw, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 6, Part 2, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 2, Part 5. The condemned man appealed from his sentence to the Parliament of Toulouse. This court decided that the case required more careful consideration than had yet been given to it, and began by ordering Arnauld d'Autrille to be confronted with Pierre Guerre and Bertrand Desrolles. Who can say what feelings animate a man who, already once condemned, finds himself subjected to a second trial? The torture, scarcely ended, begins again, and hope, though reduced to a shadow, regains her sway over his imagination, which clings to her skirts, as it were, with desperation. The exhausting efforts must be recommenced. It is the last struggle, a struggle which is more desperate in proportion, as there is less strength to maintain it. In this case, the defendant was not one of those who are easily cast down. He collected all his energy, all his courage, hoping to come victoriously out of the new combat which lay before him. The magistrates assembled in the great hall of the Parliament, and the prisoner appeared before them. He had first to deal with Pierre, and confronted him calmly, letting him speak without showing any emotion. Then he replied with indignant reproaches, dwelling on Pierre's greed and avarice, his vows of vengeance, the means employed to work upon Bertrand, his secret manoeuvres in order to gain his ends, and the unheard-of animosity displayed in hunting up accusers, witnesses, and calumniators. He defied Pierre to prove that he was not Martin Guerre, his nephew, inasmuch as Pierre had publicly acknowledged and embraced him, and his tardy suspicions only dated from the time of their violent quarrel. His language was so strong and vehement that Pierre became confused and was unable to answer, and the encounter turned entirely in Arnauld's favour, who seemed to overawe his adversary from a height of injured innocence, while the latter appeared as a disconcerted slanderer. The scene of his confrontation with Bertrand took a wholly different character. The poor woman, pale, cast down, worn by sorrow, came staggering before the tribunal, in an almost fainting condition. But as soon as she saw the prisoner, she hung her head, and covered her face with her hands. He approached her, and besought her in the gentlest accents not to persist in an accusation which might send him to the scaffold, not thus to avenge any sins he might have committed against her, although he could not reproach himself with any really serious fault. Bertrand started, and murmured in a whisper, "And Rose?" "Ah!" Arnauld exclaimed, astonished at this revelation. His part was instantly taken. Turning to the judges, "Gentlemen," he said, "my wife is a jealous woman. 10 years ago, when I left her, she had formed these suspicions. They were the cause of my voluntary exile. Today she again accuses me of guilty relations with the same person. I neither deny nor acknowledge them, but I affirm that it is the blind passion of jealousy, aided by my uncle's suggestions, guided my wife's hand when she signed this denunciation." Bertrand remained silent. "Do you dare," he continued, turning toward her, "do you dare to swear before God that jealousy did not inspire you with the wish to ruin me?" "And you," she replied, "dare you swear that I was deceived in my suspicions?" "You see, gentlemen," exclaimed the prisoner triumphantly, "her jealousy breaks forth before your eyes. Whether I am or am not guilty of the sin she attributes to me is not the question for you to decide. Can you conscientiously admit the testimony of a woman who, after publicly acknowledging me, after receiving me in her house, after living 2 years in perfect amity with me, has, in a fit of angry vengeance, thought she could give the lie to all her wards and actions? Ah, Bertrand," he he continued. "If it only concerned my life, I think I could forgive a madness of which your love is both the cause and the excuse. But you are a mother. Think of that. My punishment will recoil on the head of my daughter, who is unhappy enough to have been born since our reunion, and also our unborn child, which you condemn beforehand to curse the union which gave it being. Think of this, Bertrand. You will have to answer before God for what you are now doing." The unhappy woman fell on her knees, weeping. "I adjure you," he continued sullenly, "you, my wife, Bertrand de Rolls, to swear now, here, on the crucifix, that I am an impostor and a cheat." A crucifix was placed before Bertrand. She made a sign as if to push it away, endeavoured to speak, and feebly exclaimed, "No," then fell to the ground, and was carried out insensible. This scene considerably shook the opinion of the magistrates. They could not believe that an impostor, whatever he might be, would have sufficient daring and presence of mind thus to turn into mockery all that was most sacred. They set a new inquiry on foot, which, instead of producing enlightenment, only plunged them into still greater obscurity. Out of 30 witnesses heard, more than 3/4 agreed in identifying as Martin Guerre the man who claimed his name. Never was greater perplexity caused by more extraordinary appearances. The remarkable resemblance upset all reasoning. Some recognized him as Arnauld de Trille, and others asserted the exact contrary. He could hardly understand Basque, some said, though born in Biscay. Was that astonishing, seeing he was only 3 when he left the country? He could neither wrestle nor fence well, but having no occasion to practice these exercises, he might well have forgotten them. The shoemaker, who made his shoes aforetime, thought he took another measure, but he might have made a mistake before or be mistaken now. The prisoner further defended himself by recapitulating the circumstances of his first meeting with Bertrand on his return, the 1,001 little details he had mentioned which he only could have known, also the letters in his possession, all of which could only be explained by the assumption that he was the veritable Martin Guerre. Was it likely that he would be wounded over the left eye and leg, as the missing man was supposed to be? Was it likely that the old servant, that the 4 sisters, his Uncle Pierre, many persons to whom he had related facts known only to himself, that all the community, in short, would have recognized him? And even the very intrigue suspected by Bertrand, which had aroused her jealous anger, this very intrigue, if it really existed, was it not another proof of the verity of his claim? Since the person concerned, as interested and penetrating as the legitimate wife, had also accepted him as her former lover. Surely here was a mass of evidence sufficient to cast light on the case. Imagine an impostor arriving for the first time in a place where all the inhabitants are unknown to him, and attempting to personate a man who had dwelt there, who would have connections of all kinds, who would have played his part in 1,000 different scenes, who would have confided his secrets, his opinions, to relations, friends, acquaintances, to all sorts of people, who had also a wife, that is to say, a person under whose eyes nearly his whole life would be passed, a person would study him perpetually, with whom he would be continually conversing on every sort of subject. Could such an impostor sustain his impersonation for a single day, without his memory playing him false? From the physical and moral impossibility of playing such a part, was it not reasonable to conclude that the accused, who had maintained it for more than 2 years, was the true Martin Guerre? There seemed, in fact, to be nothing which could account for such an attempt being successfully made unless recourse was had to an accusation of sorcery. The idea of handing him over to the ecclesiastical authorities was briefly discussed, but proofs were necessary, and the judges hesitated. It is a principle of justice which has become a precept in law that in cases of uncertainty the accused has the benefit of the doubt. But at the period of which we are writing, these truths were far from being acknowledged. Guilt was presumed rather than innocence, and torture, instituted to force confession from those who could not otherwise be convicted, is only explicable by supposing the judges convinced of the actual guilt of the accused. For no one would have thought of subjecting a possibly innocent person to this suffering. However, notwithstanding this prejudice, which had been handed down to us by some organs of the public ministry, always disposed to assume the guilt of a suspected person, notwithstanding this prejudice, the judges in this case neither ventured to condemn Martin Guerre themselves as an impostor, nor to demand the intervention of the Church. In this conflict of contrary testimony, which seemed to reveal the truth only to immediately obscure it again, in this chaos of arguments and conjectures, which showed flashes of light only to extinguish them in greater darkness, consideration for the family prevailed. The sincerity of Bertrand, the future of the children, seemed reasons for proceeding with extreme caution, and this once admitted could only yield to conclusive evidence. Consequently, the Parliament adjourned the case, matters remaining in statu quo, pending a more exhaustive inquiry. Meanwhile, the accused, for whom several relations and friends gave surety, was allowed to be at liberty in Artigues, though remaining under careful surveillance. Bertrand therefore again saw him as an inmate of the house, as if no doubts had ever been cast on the legitimacy of their union. What thoughts passed through her mind during the long tete-a-tete? She had accused this man of imposture, and now, notwithstanding her secret conviction, she was obliged to appear as if she had no suspicion, as if she had been mistaken, to humiliate herself before the impostor, and ask forgiveness for the insanity of her conduct, for, having publicly renounced her accusation by refusing to swear to it, she had no alternative left. In order to sustain her part and to save the honour of her children, she must treat this man as her husband, and appear submissive and repentant. She must show him entire confidence, as the only means of rehabilitating him and lulling the vengeance of justice. What the widow of Martin Guerre must have suffered in this life of effort was a secret between God and herself, but she looked at her little daughter. She thought of her fast approaching confinement, and took courage. One evening, towards nightfall, she was sitting near him in the most private corner of the garden, with her little child on her knee, whilst the adventurer, sunk in gloomy thoughts, absently stroked Sancy's fair head. Both were silent, for at the bottom of their hearts each knew the other's thoughts, and, no longer able to talk familiarly, nor daring to appear estranged, they spent, when alone together, long hours of silent dreariness. All at once a loud uproar broke the silence of their retreat. They heard the exclamations of many persons, cries of surprise mixed with angry tones, hasty footsteps. Then the garden gate was flung violently open, and old Marguerite appeared, pale, gasping, almost breathless. Bertrand hastened toward her in astonishment, followed by her husband. But when near enough to speak, she could only answer with inarticulate sounds, pointing with terror to the courtyard of the house. They looked in this direction and saw a man standing at the threshold. They approached him. He stepped forward, as if to place himself between them. He was tall, dark. His clothes were torn. He had a wooden leg. His countenance was stern. He surveyed Bertrand with a gloomy look. She cried aloud, and fell back insensible. She recognized her real husband. Arnauld de Thrill stood petrified, while Marguerite distracted herself, endeavouring to revive her mistress. The neighbours, attracted by the noise, invaded the house and stopped, gazing with stupefaction at this astonishing resemblance. The two men had the same features, the same height, the same bearing, and suggested one being in two persons. They gazed at each other in terror, and in that superstitious age the idea of sorcery and of infernal intervention naturally occurred to those present. All crossed themselves, expecting every moment to see fire from heaven strike one or the other of the two men, or that the earth would engulf one of them. Nothing happened, however, except that both were promptly arrested, in order that the strange mystery might be cleared up. The wearer of the wooden leg, interrogated by the judges, related that he came from Spain, where first the healing of his wound, then the want of money, had detained him hitherto. He had travelled on foot, almost a beggar. He gave exactly the same reasons for leaving Artigues as had been given by the other Martin Guerre, namely a domestic quarrel caused by jealous suspicion, the desire of seeing other countries, and an adventurous disposition. He had gone back to his birthplace in Biscay. Thence he entered the service of the Cardinal of Burgos. Then the cardinal's brother had taken him to the war, and he had served with the Spanish troops at the battle of San Quentin. His leg had been shattered by an arquebus ball. So far his recital was the counterpart of the one already heard by the judges from the other man. Now they began to differ. Martin Guerre stated that he had been conveyed to a house by a man whose features he did not distinguish, that he thought he was dying, and that several hours elapsed of which he could give no account, being probably delirious, that he suffered later intolerable pain, and on coming to himself found that his leg had been amputated. He remained long between life and death, but he was cared for by peasants who probably saved his life. His recovery was very slow. He discovered that in the interval between being struck down in the battle and recovering his senses, his papers had disappeared, but it was impossible to suspect the people who had nursed him with such generous kindness of theft. After his recovery, being absolutely destitute, he sought to return to France and again see his wife and child. He had endured all sorts of privations and fatigues, and at length, exhausted, but rejoicing at being near the end of his troubles, he arrived, suspecting nothing, at his own door. Then the terror of the old servant, a few broken words, made him guess at some misfortune, and the appearance of his wife and a man so exactly like himself stupefied him. Matters had now been explained, and he only regretted that his wound had not at once ended his existence. The whole story bore the impress of truth, but when the other prisoner was asked what he had to say, he adhered to his first answers, maintaining their correctness, and again asserted that he was the real Martin Guerre, and that the new claimant could only be Arnauld de Thrill, the clever impostor, who was said to resemble himself so much that the inhabitants of Sagias had agreed in mistaking him for the said Arnauld. The two Martin Guerres were then confronted without changing the situation in the least, the first showing the same assurance, the same bold and confident bearing, while the second, calling on God and men to bear witness to his sincerity, deplored his misfortune in the most pathetic terms. The judge's perplexity was great. The affair became more and more complicated. The question remained as difficult, as uncertain as ever. All the appearances and evidences were at variance. Probability seemed to incline towards one, sympathy was more in favour of the other, but actual proof was still wanting. At length a member of the Parliament, M. de Coras, proposed as a last chance before resorting to torture, that final means of examination in a barbarous age, that Bertrand should be placed between the two rivals, trusting, he said, that in such a case a woman's instinct would divine the truth. Consequently, the two Martin Guerres were brought before the Parliament, and a few moments after Bertrande was let in, weak, pale, hardly able to stand, being worn out by suffering and advanced pregnancy. Her appearance excited compassion, and all watched anxiously to see what she would do. She looked at the two men, who had been placed at different ends of the hall, and turning from him who was nearest her, went and knelt silently before the man with the wooden leg. Then, joining her hands as if praying for mercy, she wept bitterly. So simple and touching an action roused the sympathy of all present. Arnauld de Thrill grew pale, and everyone expected that Martin Guerre, rejoiced at being vindicated by this public acknowledgment, would raise his wife and embrace her. But he remained cold and stern, and in a contemptuous tone, "Your tears, madam," he said, "they do not move me in the least. Neither can you seek to excuse your credulity by the examples of my sister and my uncle. A wife knows her husband more intimately than his other relations, as you prove by your present action. And if she is deceived, it is because she consents to the deception. You are the sole cause of the misfortunes of my house, and to you only shall I ever impute them." Thunderstruck by this reproach, the poor woman had no strength to reply, and was taken home more dead than alive. The dignified language of this injured husband made another point in his favour. Much pity was felt for Bertrande, as being the victim of an audacious deception, but everybody agreed that thus it beseemed the real Martin Guerre to have spoken. After the ordeal gone through by the wife had been also essayed by the sisters and other relatives, who one and all followed Bertrande's example and accepted the newcomer, the court, having fully deliberated, passed the following sentence, which we transcribe literally. Having reviewed the trial of Arnauld de Thrill, or Pansette, calling himself Martin Guerre, a prisoner in the concise, who appeals from the decision of the judge of Rieux, etc., we declare that this court negatives the appeal and defence of the said Arnauld de Thrill, and as punishment and amends for the imposture, deception, assumption of name and of person, adultery, rape, sacrilege, theft, larceny, and other deeds committed by the aforesaid de Thrill, and caused the above-mentioned trial, this court has condemned and condemns him to do penance before the church of Artigues, kneeling, clad in his shirt only, bareheaded and barefoot, a halter on his neck, and a burning torch in his hand, and there he shall ask pardon from God, from the king, and from justice, and from the said Martin Guerre and Bertrande de Rolls, husband and wife. And this done, the aforesaid de Thrill shall be delivered into the hands of the executioners of the king's justice, who shall lead him through the customary streets and crossroads of the aforesaid place of Artigues, and the halter on his neck shall bring him before the house of the aforesaid Martin Guerre, where he shall be hung and strangled upon a gibbet, erected for this purpose, after which his body shall be burnt, and for various reasons and considerations thereunto moving the court, it has awarded and awards the goods of the aforesaid Arnauld de Thrill, apart from the expense of justice, to the daughter born unto him by the aforesaid Bertrande de Rolls, under the pretence of marriage falsely asserted by him, having hitherto assumed the name and person of the aforesaid Martin Guerre, and by this man's deceiving the aforesaid de Rolls. And moreover the court has exempted and exempts from this trial the aforesaid Martin Guerre and Bertrande de Rolls. Also the said Pierre Guerre, uncle of the aforesaid Martin, and has remitted and remits the aforesaid Arnauld de Thrill to the aforesaid judge of Rieux, in order that the present sentence may be executed according to its form and tenor. Pronounced judicially this 12th day of September, 1560. This sentence substituted the gallows for the decapitation decreed by the first judge, inasmuch as the latter punishment was reserved for criminals of noble birth, while hanging was inflicted on meaner persons. When once his fate was decided, Arnauld du Thill lost all his audacity. Sent back to Artigues, he was interrogated in prison by the judge of Rieux, and confessed his imposture at great length. He said the idea first occurred to him when, having returned from the camp in Picardy, he was addressed as Martin Guerre by several intimate friends of the latter. He then inquired as to the sort of life, the habits and relations of this man, and, having contrived to be near him, had watched him closely during the battle. He saw him fall, carried him away, and then, as the reader has already seen, excited his delirium to the utmost in order to obtain possession of his secrets. Having thus explained his successful imposture by natural causes, which excluded any idea of magic or sorcery, he protested his penitence, implored the mercy of God, and prepared himself for execution as became a Christian. The next day, while the populace, collecting from the whole neighbourhood, had assembled before the parish church of Artigues in order to behold the penance of the criminal, who, barefoot, attired in a shirt, and holding a lighted torch in his hand, knelt at the entrance of the church, another scene, no less painful, took place in the house of Martin Guerre. Exhausted by her suffering, which had caused a premature confinement, Bertrande lay on her couch of pain, and besought pardon from him who she had innocently wronged, entreating him also to pray for her soul. Martin Guerre, sitting at her bedside, extended his hand, and blessed her. She took his hand and held it to her lips. She could no longer speak. All at once a loud noise was heard outside. The guilty man had just been executed in front of the house. When finally attached to the gallows, he uttered a terrible cry, which was answered by another from inside the house. The same evening, while the body of the malefactor was being consumed by fire, the remains of a mother and child were laid to rest in consecrated ground. End of Chapter 2, Part 5. End of Martin Guerre. End of Volume 6, Part 2 of Celebrated Crimes.